The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay, go ahead.
Commissioner Eric Brousseau, Commission Counsel, and I'd like to call OPP Superintendent Pat Morris as the Commission's next witness.
Superintendent Morris, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
I will swear.
We have the Bible, the Quran, or the Torah available.
Bible?
Please take the Bible in your right hand. For the record, please state your full name and spell it out.
Patrick John Joseph Morris, M-O-R-R-I-S.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth so help you God?
I do swear.
Good afternoon, Superintendent Morris.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to start with an easy one. What is your current rank?
I'm a superintendent in the OPP, Bureau Commander of the Provincial Operations Intelligence Bureau.
And is that the rank that you held in January and February 2022?
That's correct.
Okay. And I'd like to call up your interview summary, which is WTS 6035. And this is a summary of the interview that Commission Counsel conducted with you in the summer, correct?
Correct.
And you're familiar with the contents of this summary?
I am.
You have no corrections to make to it?
No.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned that you oversee the OPP's Provincial Operations Intelligence Bureau, which I will refer to as POIB. Can you tell us how long have you overseen that bureau?
I've been the superintendent in charge of POIB since September of 2021, having acted in that position since July of 2021. And prior to that, I was an inspector in POIB responsible for 2 sections that are relevant to these matters.
Okay. And can you give us the 30-second elevator pitch of what POIB does?
Yes. Provincial Operations Intelligence Bureau is the intelligence directorate or bureau for the Ontario Provincial Police, so responsible for our jurisdiction and also under the Police Services Act for issues where we provide specialized investigative services. We have 6 sections within the bureau. The first is Intelligence Operations section, which has to do with organized crime, etc. The second is the Protective Services section, which has to do with close body protection for protected persons in the province of Ontario. The third is Covert Operations section, which has to do administratively with the policies and procedures in relation to covert operations, undercover operations, informant recruitment, agent recruitment and handling, and also the operational responsibility for that. The next section is the Criminal Intelligence Production section, which is primarily the handling of metadata information and the translation of information into intelligence. And the last section is the Provincial Anti-Terrorism section, which is a large-scale joint force operation which engages in intelligence operations covertly and overtly in relation to national security threats. Lastly, we're engaged in the integrated national security enforcement teams.
Thank you.
If I could just interrupt, Superintendent, just if you could slow down a little bit because all this is getting translated as you go. So
Sure.
I know you're effective, but effective with a little more patience in speaking will help. Thanks.
Will do.
Thank you, Superintendent. You're familiar with the term Project Hendon. Can you describe for us what Project Hendon is?
Yes. You'll have to cut me short, probably. In 2019 and early 2020, the OPP witnessed a significant amount of protest, dissent, some of which caused us reasonable grounds to suspect or believe that those issues would engage in criminal activity or illegal activity that would have a public safety impact. As a result of that, we created a collection plan and reached out to partners in law enforcement and in the intelligence community to create a cooperative, collaborative approach to collect information on issues that related to that. The reasoning was many of these issues, I might say all of those issues, are larger than any specific jurisdiction. So we collected a collection plan, we made a collection plan, we created business rules, and we formally reached out to multiple agencies in Ontario, law enforcement, intelligence. We went further than Ontario, engaging federal agencies such as the RCMP, many components within the RCMP, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Department of National Defence, and then other police services were added as we went along because there was impact. So for example, the Vancouver Police Department, Sûreté du Québec, etc. The rationale for Hendon was to deal with large-scale protest matters that impacted public safety. Very specifically, we did look at reasonable grounds to suspect and believe as a sort of precursor for our involvement. In a very practical way, at the beginning of 2020 and the end of 2019, there was activity going on that had to do under the umbrella of Shut Down Canada. It was activity that activists would engage in to have a negative impact on the Canadian economy and on the Canadian democratic system generally. As we move towards February of 2020, one of the major points of consideration was rail blockades, rail shutdowns, which came to pass in Tyendinaga for approximately 3 weeks, emanating from events in British Columbia, specifically the Wet'suwet'en issues and dealing with gas pipelines, Coastal GasLink, etc. We began at that time to engage closely with all of our partners because there were main events such as Tyendinaga, such as British Columbia, but there were also a proliferation of events. And as my colleague, Inspector Bowden will say, and Provincial Liaison Team, it was impacting multiple jurisdictions. And so that's how we chose to approach it. As time evolved, we had several events in Caledonia and in the Mackenzie Meadows occupation, which were relevant to our duties and also had impact for other police services. I believe at that time, we engaged approximately 30 entities. We had regular calls, we had regular dissemination of intelligence products, and we regularly collected information for that purpose. As the pandemic became more pronounced or more prolonged, some of those public safety concerns or threat variants altered. By April of 2021, we noted the emergence of something that we referred to as the Patriot Movement. And we focused on this specifically because it presented different threat components. I will say this, we had concerns. There was very, very little criminal activity. There was illegal activity, and there were impacts that we were facing. So through the summer of 2021, we noted more and more of that activity. I will also say that other factors occurred, such as hate crime statistics that were published in August of 2021. As a result of that, we evolved our collection plan and collaborated with our partners to focus on what we considered to be the primary threats. Our findings, our intelligence, our assessed information was produced to all of our partners in the form of the Hendon Strategic Intelligence Reports, and I believe that was going out at that time to about 32 agencies, and it was going out to approximately 200 individuals within those agencies.
Thank you. If I could ask for document OPP 404571. And Superintendent Morris, I don't know if you can see that on your screen. Is this a list of the Hendon reports and who they were distributed to?
Yes, so I recall this list very specifically. What you note in blue is a Hendon Strategic Intelligence Report or situation report that was disseminated. What you note in white in the first column on the left is a teleconference, because that was regular as well. And then we evolved our dissemination. We had our main Hendon group. On January 21st of 2021, our Commissioner Carrick, asked me to begin to disseminate that intelligence product to 9 police services, the chiefs of the 9 police services, to ensure that they were aware. So that's what you see in one column, the Hendon group. In the next column, where you see the highlight in yellow, the third column is a column I created because of our geographical distribution to keep the OPP commanders aware. And the last column is our commissioners' command team, which consists of 3 deputy commissioners and our commissioner.
And those are all individuals or groups who received the Hendon reports, is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And you also mentioned teleconferences, and so I'd just like to bring up document OPP 401782. I believe this may be a list that you put together as well. Is this a list of all of the Hendon teleconferences during this period?
Beginning on January 21st, yes, of 2022. That's correct.
Okay. And roughly how often were the teleconferences?
Only germane to this issue?
Yes.
We held our first one on January 21st, and then on January 24th, we completed them daily, I believe, with one exception.
Okay. And who from the OPS participated in those teleconferences?
Okay, so that's a difficult question to answer, but I will do my best. We had a dissemination list, which was very large, as I've described. At this point in time, I mean January 21st, we had grown to approximately 300 participants. From the Ottawa Police Service, given that Hendon had evolved since 2020, there were multiple people on the distribution list for the documents, and that same list received a request to participate in the teleconference. We could not go through our entire list from Vancouver and across Canada every time, so we only knew the people who identified as participating. I can say that the members from Ottawa that showed great consistency in their participation were Detective Constables George Boris, Detective Constable Steph Quinnell. At other times, and I apologize, I'm not always aware of the rank, I believe it's Staff Sergeant Isabel Lemieux. The superintendents participated at time. In that case, I mean Mark Patterson, Inspector Ken Bryden. There were other people from events and intelligence that participated at various times, and we would only know it specifically by them self-identifying.
Thank you. I want to take you to one of the early Hendon reports. It's OPP 401600. This is the Hendon report from Thursday, January 13th. Is this the first Hendon report in which the idea of a convoy approaching downtown Ottawa is mentioned?
I'd like to make a point of clarification here. The simple answer is yes.
Okay.
But from August of 2021 to the end of December 2021, there were regular reports, approximately one a week. The discussion about the possibility of a galvanized effort to illustrate to Ottawa some of the grievances and the possibilities of doing that via a convoy was often discussed and was often in the Hendon reports. The events that were planned came to very little fruition, I would say, or minimal fruition. So it was discussed, it was commented upon in the reports previous to this. But in this report is the first finite plan that says we are going to do this and we are going to do it on these dates.
Okay, and so that information, I think it appears under key information point number 1. Individuals within the Patriot movement have undertaken to organize through closed communication channels and in-person networking towards large-scale protest actions. One of these actions includes a commercial truck work stoppage and highway slowdown scheduled for January 23rd. Information shared through social media networks indicates some of the participants of this action may be mobilizing from across the country to arrive in Ottawa for a mass anti-government protest calling for an end to all COVID-19 mandates. And is it fair to say that's the extent of POIB's knowledge at the time?
Well, I think it's a little bit more extensive than that, but That's just a summation provided for quick reference for people who are reading the document.
Okay. And if we can go down to the bottom of the page, it's a little bit small, but meanwhile, the shift from the government appears to have had little effect on the organizing underway by members of the Patriot movement who have taken to social media advising truckers' plan to carry out their intended work stoppage. And so as of January 13th, was POIB of the view that there was going to be a mass convoy to Ottawa?
Yes.
And what were the sources of this early knowledge of the convoy?
So we had multiple investigative techniques that we were employing. So I could run through them. One was open source collection. And I want to stress that's information. Open source, so I put a lesser value on that at the origin point. Also, we had covert operations ongoing, which you won't see as related in the documentation before you because of the sensitivities. We engaged in a large degree of analysis and at times surveillance operations, and that's primary and source recruitment for covert operations. That information, all of which is information, is collected, and then we go through the collation and analysis process, and then we provide our analysis, which I refer to as intelligence, and that is how we came to the conclusions and assessments that we did.
Okay, and I want to take you to the next Hendon report, which is OPP 401028, and that one is dated Thursday, January 20th. So at this point, Superintendent, the reports are being published just on a weekly basis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And if you see the information in the key information box there, number one, the Freedom Convoy 2022 and Operation Bear Hug will almost certainly disrupt the movement of vehicular traffic and goods on Canadian highways and possibly at ports of entry along the border with the United States. And then point two, some participants in these convoys may attempt to disrupt the business of government at both the provincial and federal level by blocking access to government, legislatures, and parliament. Does that accurately summarize the risk as POIB understood it?
Yes, it does, and if I can just add a comment, as a result of the information we became aware of in early January, as reflected in the first report you showed to me, we stepped up our assignments, our taskings, and our information collection in order to produce more intelligence on what we felt was a burgeoning priority.
Okay, and if I could take you now to page 3, there's a paragraph there, further redacted, that there does not yet appear to be an exit strategy for departing Ottawa. The intent appears to be to remain in Ottawa until all COVID-19 mandates and restrictions are lifted. So what can you tell us about what POIB understood the timeline for this protest to be as of the date of this report, which is January 20th?
Yeah, it's an important question. For those not actively engaged in intelligence operations, there are knowns and unknowns. And we key in on those as intelligence gaps. So in this case, the fact that there was no exit strategy, but there were extensive demands being placed, and the fact that we felt those demands could not be met, it meant that they, meaning the protesters, would be there for a long period of time. And I do want to say this might appear to be anecdotal. I refer to intelligence as being engaged in acquiring secrets or mysteries. Their plans while in Ottawa were not a secret that we couldn't discern. The plans while in Ottawa were a mystery until they got there, and I think that is borne out by events.
And I think we'll see some reports later. If we could go to page 4, towards the bottom, I believe. So there we go. In addition to the convoys themselves, police of jurisdiction resources could be stretched if rallies are organized at the local level to coincide with the arrival of the convoys in a given community. And so can you sort of unpack that for us in terms of your concern about the police of jurisdiction?
Sure. So throughout COVID-19 and the impacts of COVID-19, and specifically since, I'll say, the spring of 2021, the growth of various movements, and I want to be clear on this, this is not one monolithic entity. These are grassroots, what I refer to as affinity groups that share grievances. They acted locally and also tried to coalesce. And I would say that this was the first successful coalescence. So in doing so, the information that we were collecting and the analysis that we were engaging in to produce the intelligence illustrated that yes, Ottawa would be the culmination of this, but there would be other factors along the way and across the country, and specifically in relation to specific infrastructure like border crossings, and specifically in relation to what we refer to as the business of government, so Queen's Park and also obviously Parliament. That's what I mean. And discussion of plans to exceed our resources and our capacity to respond.
Okay, and I'd like to ask you about the next paragraph, which I believe Councillor Deans may have been taken to as well. Although the stated intent of some convoy participants is to remain at Parliament Hill until the government rescinds all COVID-19 related restrictions and mandates, this goal is likely to prove unrealistic in the long term. However, even a small number of tractor trailers parked at Parliament Hill will almost certainly be disruptive in the short term. So why did POIB think that it was unrealistic in the long term but extremely disruptive in the short term?
Yeah, I'm thankful you asked me that. They had certain demands. We felt the demands could not be met, but we believed it would be unlikely for them to follow through on the promise to stay until the mandates were lifted. But we did think that it would be a long term. It's just that over the period of time that would transpire, people would become frustrated. People would need to return home. I want to be clear, we felt this would be a long-term event.
And when you say long-term, we're in January 20th. When you say long-term, what did you mean by long-term at that time?
We felt that they would arrive on January 28th to 29th, and we were positioning ourselves to be prepared for a longer term. I don't know that I had a specific idea in mind, but we were even beginning to schedule and plan at that time for, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, et cetera. And we also didn't know what the nature of negotiations or discussion would be, i.e. in Tyendinaga, that occurred with multiple levels of government, so those things would have impact as well. But even at this time, we were talking about scheduling to have relief, et cetera, and we were engaged in the OPP within our major incident management group to be planning between the various entities that engage in that group.
Okay. I'd like to take you next to the Hendon report from Saturday, January 22nd. It's OPP 401603. And if we could go to page 2 when we get there. Under the assessment, it says, it is almost certain that the Freedom Convoy will disrupt the flow of traffic and goods along Canadian roadways and at border points. So how is it and why is it that POIB had concluded that was almost certain by January 22nd?
Because the information that we were collecting from open sources and other venues, it was consistent that this is what they intended to do. That's one point. One of the critical points in producing intelligence is the reliability of the source, but also the validity of the information in juxtaposition with all the other information. Traveling from British Columbia or Nova Scotia to Ottawa shows an incredible motivation, and we felt that it would be there for a long period of time. And we felt that for the most part, the entities that were engaged in the planning would follow through on what they were saying.
Why did you feel that the entities engaged in the planning, you mean the organizers, the
Yes.
convoy organizers? Why did you feel that they were going to follow through?
The pronouncements they made were in earnest. I felt that they meant what they said. The grievances, and I want to stress there were multiple grievances, had been expressed at this point for about 18 months. We had seen expressions of those grievances in multiple jurisdictions throughout Ontario specifically. There were new factors that we took into account. The experiences that were faced during the federal election illustrated that people were prepared to go to further lengths to illustrate dissatisfaction. The experience with the incoming passports that had occurred in relation to COVID-19, the impacts in the workplace for some people and how some people experienced that, the vaccination, I think it was called pediatric vaccination. These were all factors that for the people involved, for the people motivated, impacted their motivation and increased their frustration, and we believe that they would follow through on what they were saying they would do.
If we could scroll down on the page, there's a section called Intelligence Gaps, Collection Requirements. Can you explain for us what appears in this section?
Sure. In any intelligence initiative, you create a collection plan. And when you satisfy the collection plan, then you feel you've filled that gap. But always you have gaps that are still there. The numbers are always a gap. Like, so for example, I've been asked a lot about the numbers. We couldn't possibly know what the numbers would be because until that given day, we don't know how many people will arrive. What we could do, and what we did do, was reach out to our colleagues in the RCMP through the divisions to get assessments of the numbers of people to the extent they could, the numbers of vehicles to the extent they could, and specifically on tractor trailers, the types of vehicles, the mood, the behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So we were trying to determine the size, the impact of the protest, et cetera. Now that's for all. Now also in terms of being armed, I want to be clear on this. We had we produced no intelligence to indicate that these individuals would be armed. And there has been a lot of hyperbole about that. That was something we wish to, when people think about what happened on January 6th of 2020, that is presence of mind, but we produced no intelligence to indicate that that would be the case.
I understand. If we could go down, I want to go to the last 2 points in intelligence gaps, which are on the next page. Oh, if we just scroll up, sorry. The last 2 points. One is plan for any further action should demands not be met, and plans for departing Ottawa. So this is information that POIB does not have at that time.
That's correct. So if I could just use, I guess, perhaps some of my experience, I've worked in undercover operations and managed undercover operations in entities that have significant grievances. And in some of those instances, very specific plans are made and followed through or not followed through. Apart from stages, music, speeches, et cetera, we could see no specific plans for actions of that type. And we believed, because of the amalgamation of affinity groups, there really was no specific plan in relation to that. It was a matter of, we call it being event-driven, and we'll see what happens when we get there, et cetera. We had no expectation that their demands would be met, and so we wondered if that would create increased frustration, and then we tried to collect information to produce intelligence on how that frustration might be borne out.
Thank you. I want to take you to the Hendon report for Monday, January 24th now, which is OPP 401608. And I'll take you to page 2 under assessment when we get there. So the first paragraph, convoy organizers will almost certainly have minimal ability to influence the behavior of convoy participants and protest attendees. Why was that a concern, and if so, why was that a concern?
We were collecting information and producing intelligence on the organizers. That was a fast-moving atmosphere of individuals that we didn't necessarily know a lot about, nor do they come from our province. So those individuals may have a plan, probably a fairly loose plan, but when a large-scale protest, event, et cetera, occurs, there will be a lot of individuals or entities that attach themselves to that protest atmosphere. And then they may engage in activity that has absolutely nothing to do with what the individuals who are organizing the protest entertain. So we were collecting information, which is part of our normal operation, about affinity groups or associated entities that may attach themselves to this protest and trying to determine what their actions may be.
And did POIP take any additional steps when it realized that the sort of convoy organizers weren't necessarily going to have control over the participants?
I can say that we had already taken steps in terms of individual entities that we were concerned about. We already had ongoing operations that would inform us as to what was occurring in those milieu and would they be engaged, et cetera.
If we could pull up OPP 401047, please. This is an email exchange between yourself and Sebastian Tremblay. And I just want to go down to the bottom of the first page. Sebastian writes, you loved that you asked the RCMP to take some lead on their side to get information from West and East. I can't believe that you had to ask, though. So can you tell me a bit about the process of getting information from the RCMP and specifically what that comment there was referring to?
Our collection plan for this issue specifically needed to have the information on numbers, vehicles, mood, et cetera, that was emanating from several different locations at various times. If I could just give an example, from BC on January 22nd. But it's not just BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. It's various locations. Also, en route, there were a number of mini events that occurred in Regina, Medicine Hat, Winnipeg, and I'm only speaking to the west because that was the longest period of time. And we needed to get that information. And so we were reaching out, during the Hendon calls to basically create what we refer to as an intelligence requirement for the divisions of intelligence in the RCMP. And the reason Sebastian is referring to it is we did the same thing with the Sûreté du Québec.
Thank you. If we could pull up the Hendon report for Tuesday, January 25th, which is OPP 401609. And so here we're, just to situate us, we're Tuesday before the sort of the arrival of the convoys in Ottawa. If we get on page 1 under information, those first 3 bullet points, I won't read them all, but it suggests that there's 1,200 trucks coming. The Regina Police said there were 1,200 trucks coming. There's another unconfirmed information about 162 trucks and 1,000 private vehicles. And the Sûreté Québec says 1,000 to 1,500 trucks. Is it fair to say that as of January 25th, it was anticipated that the convoy would involve thousands of trucks and vehicles?
It's fair to say that the numbers would be extensive, and I would say in the hundreds. And the reason I say that is this. A lot of the events in the western part of the country were still a great distance from Ottawa. And may not come to Ottawa. And there were a lot of localized events where people might just drive and participate exuberantly, yes, but they might only participate as far as Winnipeg. And for us in the Ontario Provincial Police, we are cognizant the drive from the Manitoba border to Ottawa is like a 20-hour drive. So we could not assess necessarily whether those truck drivers or the drivers of private vehicles, commercial vehicles would continue. In Quebec, much easier to do due to proximity when Sebastian in Quebec Quebec City and Montreal. Certainly, though, to your point, we knew it would be in the hundreds, and we knew it would be significant. And there were multiple convoys because that's the information coming at that time from the west due to the distance to be traveled. But there were multiple convoys from within Ontario that just hadn't left yet.
Okay. And I'd like to go down to page 2 of this report and to the second last bullet. And I just ask you about fundraising. It indicates that at this point, on the 25th, the GoFundMe is at $4.4 million, which is an increase of almost $1 million in the last 24 hours. Was this something that POIB was keeping an eye on and concerned about?
We were definitely keeping an eye on it, and here's why. For any type of event of this nature, no matter what the motivation is, social media has altered the way we collect information and the meaning that we derive from it. We can always significantly discount some of the numbers that like it or say they'll be there. What we noticed in this event and in some other previous events related to these grievances was that there was much more meaning in the support. And the reason that the finances are so important is money is a powerful motivator, and this was growing rapidly. And I can say it was growing at a rate that for us was unprecedented. And so that added impact to our assessment that this would be significant.
And if you can just help me understand, was it concern about what the money would be used for, or is it that the money coming in is a reflection that this is truly there's some widespread support for it, and that's concerning, or is it both?
I think it's both. We definitely felt there was widespread support. I mean, I realized that the narrative, going back to the spring of 2021, the narrative was that people who felt a certain way were a small number of people, were et cetera, the fringe, so to speak. This was difficult for us to deal with in policing in Ontario, specifically because there was a large degree of support, and there were a number of instances. So it spoke to that support. That's one thing. And yes, how the money would be utilized. There were a lot of ways we knew the money would be utilized in our information, fuel and logistics, et cetera. We didn't know all the factors, but the biggest takeaway from the money was the degree of support and the means that would be in possession to make it more long-term, even for things such as accommodations.
If we could go down, I just want to ask you about the last paragraph under assessment. The lack of information related to the OPP about events in Ottawa during the period from January 28th to the 29th and on January 30th represents a serious intelligence gap. Information provided to the OPP to date indicates a high degree of planning for the protest, and communications appear to have been open between the OPP and convoy organizers. It is unknown why the details for these timeframes would not be shared with police. Attempts should be made to obtain this information. Why weren't you able to get that information out of the convoy organizers if there was a kind of good rapport with the PLT or undercover officers?
I think the answer is quite simple, because there was no major definitive plan. The organizing went into the convoy, the transport, the participation, but the event, what would actually transpire, was less organized. And I would say that in my experience, that isn't that unusual.
And so we're now, it's Tuesday, January 25th. By this date, what was POIB's expectation about how long this would last?
Well, I can't give a day. I can say this. We saw significant support. We saw significant fundraising. In real terms, we saw that play out in significant numbers of people and significant numbers of commercial vehicles and private support. In fact, our information from coming across Western Canada was not only that, it was almost unanimous in our calls that there were people lined up on the sides of highways and on overpasses. And we even got to the point of talking about inclement weather, that people were there, and we were quite surprised. So we felt it would be a significant event, and it would be a long-term event, specifically because the demands could not be met. And the promise was to stay until they were met.
I'm gonna put my long-term question to you again, because I don't know that I got an answer, but when you say long-term, do you mean, it's not just the weekend, it's a week, it's 2 weeks, possibly 3 weeks? What do you mean by long-term?
Oh, certainly a couple weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, there's just so many variables after a plan meets a response that I can't speak to that. And I didn't know what the plan of the Ottawa Police Service was. So when I say long-term, I'm going to say, certainly a week, probably 2 weeks, et cetera.
Okay. And why isn't it that it was ever spelled out in that degree of specificity in the Hendon reports to say these people might stay for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks?
Yeah, it's a good point, and perhaps that's something that we can take away to improve our products in the future. These are strategic intelligence reports. There were other products that were provided that were operational and tactical in nature. We felt that we were stating that this will be a significant event and a long-term event, but we didn't say the number of days, and I can't. I played this back in my mind in terms of knowing what I know today. What would I say if I could put myself back on January 25th, to use an example? And I would basically say what we said, but I don't know that I could have put a day to it.
I understand. If we could pull up OPP 401612. This is, I believe, a situational awareness bulletin for the Freedom Convoy. So who would have received this, Superintendent?
So these are documents that we create and put out to our frontline officers so that they are aware of what's occurring. And and there may be an officer safety component, it may just be informational, but we also have a vested interest. It's a way to collect information. So this document absolutely would have gone to every member of the Ontario Provincial Police. And I have an independent recollection that this document was sent with our Hendon report to our recipients. So in so saying, that would go to approximately 32 services as well. We also provided it to the Criminal Intelligence Services of Ontario so it could be further disseminated. So it was disseminated broadly.
And it would have been up to those other agencies to disseminate it to their officers if they chose to.
Right. They could utilize it in any way they could, parade briefings, shift briefings, et cetera, or dissemination.
Okay, and if we look at the second paragraph under background, I won't read that whole thing, but this is generally POIB's understanding as of January 26th, that there's no express departure date for when participants will disperse or the action will end?
That's correct.
Did, on the Hendon teleconferences, did you or anyone from POIB specifically say, take the next step and say, so you should be preparing for a 2-week protest, a 3-week protest, a 4-week protest?
We talked about it being long-term. We talked about the logistical capacity of the entities involved. We talked about the degree of grievances. Most of the discussion was involved in collecting, just to give you, I would do an overview and introduce it and say what the pertinent issues were for the day in terms of information collection and intelligence production. Then our inspector, Brian Barkley, who was our case manager, would have an analytical overview provided by our lead analysts strategically and tactically. And then we would go to the other entities in basically an order of primary importance, Ottawa Police Service being key, the RCMP being key, and the Sûreté du Québec being key. And then we would do a roundtable for everybody's input, et cetera. Certainly, we discussed this being long-term. and what intelligence requirements we would have in order to be help out. We recognize that the Ottawa Police Service was our primary client. That there's only a few points in time over this period of time, roughly up till February 20th, where the clients alter to Toronto Police Service, et cetera. Ottawa is, and the Windsor Police Service.
Okay. If we could pull up OPP 401611, which is the Hendon report for the next day, Thursday, January 27th. And on the front of this Hendon report, there's a list of convoys, and a number of them, I mean, the first one has 471, but many of them have a TBD. Why is that?
So there's some, I noticed that we were being pressed for numbers. And at this point, I reached out to our Indigenous Policing Bureau, and that may seem strange to some people who are listening, but our Indigenous Policing Bureau houses our provincial liaison teams, and our provincial liaison teams are interlocutors to organizers, to truck drivers, to all of the people responsible for running the protest, and they had established relationships. So they were the individuals who were providing the numbers because they were there to observe them and stay in one place to do that. So at the start, it was difficult, and I believe in some of the cases there was really difficult weather, et cetera. So we made a clear delineation about who would be responsible for which tasks. So on this case, I'm sorry, what is the date of that?
January 27th.
Okay, so that's why the numbers weren't there on that point in time.
Did POIB extrapolate or have any kind of estimate of the numbers as of that date, or was this is the best estimate there is?
I think in our assessments we said, you know, it's going to be significant, like in the hundreds.
Okay, if we could go down to page bottom.
Could I just make a point? A lot of your questions have to do with preparation and the purpose of intelligence. I just wanted to explain my mindset. And this might seem anecdotal, but it's important to me. Intelligence is made up of two words, inter and legere, and in Latin that means to choose between. So I really see it as our job as the Intelligence Bureau, in so much as the Police Service Act permits us to help police of jurisdiction in specialized services, to inform decision-making, to allow them to choose between operational courses of action in their preparation. So that's the premise under which we were working.
I see. If we could go down to, to the bottom of page 4. The first paragraph there, it is highly unlikely that heavy machinery would be transported in the convoy if there was no intent to use it or if some individuals in the convoy did not anticipate that it would be needed. What can you tell us about the risk of heavy machinery and what steps POIB took to gather that information?
Right. So this is a key component. I'd have to put you in the mindset of the Ontario Provincial Police at this point. In terms of large-scale critical incidents and protests, Mackenzie Meadows occupation, which occurred in close proximity to Six Nations, for which there was an injunction in September of 2020, was something that we were contemplating at this time. There was the theft of some large-scale heavy machinery and the use of that heavy machinery to tear up roads and impact rail lines and to threaten critical infrastructure such as gas lines, et cetera. So that was something that was heavy on our minds at the time. We had no intelligence to indicate what the use of that heavy machinery would be it compressors, be it tractors, et cetera, apart from some in relation to snow clearing for the purposes of parking. So that was a key thing that we were trying to determine, because the inductive leap there is, why bring the equipment if you have no intent to utilize it?
What kind of heavy equipment did you see?
There were, like, on the back of flatbeds, there was a large compressor. There were all-terrain vehicles, and I'm sorry, I don't know I mean a very, very large, like a monster truck type all-terrain vehicle. And then there was equipment that could be utilized for digging, et cetera.
Okay. If we could go to the next Hendon report, it's OPP 50815. And this is the report for Friday, January 28th. And it's got an updated list of convoy numbers at the front. And so by the next day, essentially, you've got some more information about convoys coming, descending upon Ottawa. And can you just explain for us what CMV and PMV are?
Yeah, commercial motor vehicles and personal motor vehicles. And the rationale for the delineation is that large-scale commercial motor vehicles would be consistent with the intentions of the organizers and also more detrimental and more impactful in terms of impeding the business of government in downtown Ottawa.
Okay. And the number has jumped from 500 and something the day before. Now there's over 1,300 vehicles that are sort of confirmed. Was that concerning to POIB?
Yeah, absolutely, it was concerning. I mean, just from a planning perspective, what this is causing, this puts me in a hard spot because I'm not in the Ottawa Police Service. But if I was a detachment commander in Aurelia, and if I was facing this situation, you're saying to yourself, where are these trucks planning to go? And how will we house this? How will we manage this? And at a certain point, the numbers become irrelevant because once you surpass a certain number, it basically becomes impossible.
And did you know where the trucks were planning to go or where OPS was planning to put the trucks at this point?
No, I was not involved in OPS planning.
Okay. If we could go down to page 7. Before we get there, just were you concerned about what was being done with this information, sort of in the week leading up and the Hendon reports we've just looked at? Were you concerned, I know you just told us you weren't involved in the planning, but were you concerned that planning wasn't being based on the reports at all?
Well, I'll be blunt, I wouldn't know if the planning was being based on the reports. We have an expression often in policing that you stay within your lane. And so my lane, pardon the pun, my lane is intelligence. And my goal, as I saw it, was to produce intelligence to assist in decision-making, both to the Ontario Provincial Police and to the Ottawa Police Service, which is what I was attempting to do. I was involved in planning, as I've mentioned, in the Ontario Provincial Police. We created the Major Incident Management Group. And so we were having discussions about that as it would impact other jurisdictions, including, and most specifically, including our own.
Okay. And so just for clarity, did you observe anything that caused you to believe that the intelligence wasn't being actioned on the OPS planning side?
No, I didn't see Ottawa Police Service planning. I assume they were planning. I now know information I didn't in terms of other people's witness statements. I assume they were planning. Ottawa is a very experienced police service and has dealt with many of these events. So I knew that they would be planning and utilizing that information.
Okay. If we could go down to the bottom of page 7, there's under assessment, the first paragraph. The available information indicates that the protesters plan to remain in Ottawa at least until February 4th. We continue to identify indicators to support at least some protesters remaining beyond the weekend of the 29th and 30th. These indicators include collecting donations of cash, food, and water from supporters. When was the February 4th date chosen, and how was that date arrived at?
I can't recall specifically why February 4th was said, but I believe it was the collection or capturing of open source information that cited February 4th. But I'll say again, that would have only been from one entity of many. And so for me personally, the dates are less important than the fact that there was going to be significance and longevity to the event.
Right.
If I could just use an example, I know you're asking a lot about that, and it's an important question. In other events, such as Toronto, both on the 5th of February and the 12th of February, in that case, we had definitive information about timing from the events. We will not be there for long. It will be this long, et cetera. We will not stay.
I'd like to take you to the Saturday, January 29th Hendon report, which is OPP 401614. And so this is the first day, essentially, of the planned protest. Some of the convoys arrived the day before, but this is the first day. And if we go down to page 3, under the assessment, there's a bolded paragraph, or a sentence, sorry. The protest in Ottawa has the potential to pose a real public safety and officer safety threat. And so can you unpack that for us and tell us why POIB had made that conclusion on day one of the protest?
Yep, just with the numbers that were there and the grievances that were possessed, we felt that there was the potential for a public safety threat. And an officer safety threat due to the role that police officers are put into in these situations. There was specifically a great deal of frustration in the province of Ontario with police services in Ontario enforcing the Reopening Ontario Act because a lot of people, and some people who are philosophically supportive of that side, felt that it wasn't our role, and that even the fact that it was unjust and unconstitutional, and that would elevate the threat posed by some people towards the police.
And so I guess, what can you tell us about, was that just a worry, or were you actually seeing sort of threatening or aggressive behavior right at the outset?
So first, coming across Canada, and I'm going to speak bluntly, but I have to say that I'm trying to be blunt, but I don't have all the facts in relation to this. There was almost no reported criminal activity of any of this activity coming across Canada. There was a motor vehicle collision on the day before the event, and that had to do with somebody running into somebody who was in the Freedom Convoy. So it was conspicuous for the absolute lack of criminal activity. So we were concerned because when a plan meets a counter plan, we didn't know what would transpire. We were also concerned in large cities such as Ottawa, such as Toronto, protests attract a multitude of elements who may have absolutely nothing to do with the protest. There's been a lot made of extremists, et cetera. That's a difficult word for me because it doesn't really have a definition in law and it's very subjective. But even individuals with an individual agenda, sometimes I refer to it as an independent asymmetric threat in the vernacular, lone wolf. That's a type of thing that we were more concerned about.
Got it. If we could go to the next day's Hendon report, Tuesday, February 1st. Yes, not the next day. OPP 401617. And if we could go down to page 4, we get there. At the bottom, we are unable to confirm a potential second convoy that may travel to Ottawa from Western Canada. We continue to monitor this issue closely. We also continue to monitor the blockade at the Canada-US border in Alberta. The strategy for managing or resolving this blockade is highly likely to have repercussions in Ontario. Can you tell us why POIB saw them as related and why managing one would have repercussions in the other?
Sure. In the Ontario Provincial Police, we've come to call this the elastic effect. When you deal with a specific event in a specific locale, the dealing with that event will immediately lead to a flurry of social media, some true, some not. And that information that emanates will have an impact. So we've experienced that with a large degree of protests elsewhere. We experienced that in G8 and G20. We've experienced that with Indigenous critical incidents. So whenever we go to take an action in a location, we do a strategic intelligence assessment to try to ascertain what the impact of that action will have. So to be very specific to this, if the RCMP took action on the border in Alberta, and if the individuals in Alberta or the individual entities were closely connected to people in the Ottawa, then there would be an impact.
So let me ask you, did having been in charge of intelligence for Hendon throughout this, did you observe that at any point?
Sorry, did I observe what?
Did you observe a sort of reaction in one part of the country to some sort of enforcement action in a different part of the country?
Yeah, so just please recall that Hendon wasn't all about this threat variant. So Hendon actually came to fruition as a result of the enforcement action in British Columbia in relation to the Wet'suwet'en having immediate and apparent ramifications in Tyendinaga for 3 weeks, and then in the area of Six Nations for like a month, and then in the area of Six Nations again in Caledonia and Mackenzie Meadows for a period of months. So significantly, yes. In relation to this activity, yes. The publications of enforcement in relation to the Reopening Ontario Act led at times to other activity and other protests. I remember specifically events in Toronto that had to do with certain restaurants acting in defiance of the Reopening Ontario Act, having an impact in relation to protest. So that is why Coots, Alberta was important to us. And I should also say that at this point, and from January 29th on, our lens and our collection had evolved significantly. From January 29th on, and every day until the fruition, the Ontario Provincial Police, with the permission of the Ottawa Police Service, was engaged on ground in a covert capacity to collect information about all the things that we'd be interested in terms of mood, tenor, plans, et cetera.
I'd like to go to the Hendon report, OPP 401619. This is from Thursday, February 3rd. And when we're there, if we can go to page 5 under the combined assessment heading. The ongoing truck blockades in Ottawa and Coots, Alberta have the potential to develop into a national civil disobedience movement that could extend to maritime transportation and potentially other major transportation sections. It is highly likely that new convoys, blockades, and protests in support of the Ottawa blockade will occur in Ontario for the foreseeable future and will strain law enforcement resources. So can you tell us why you thought, or why the term national civil disobedience movement was chosen here?
Yeah, civil disobedience or direct action are terms we use for protests when it pushes beyond totally lawful dissent, like entirely lawful dissent. And given that we had a great deal of online rhetoric requesting, if you cannot travel here, act locally, and we had organic movements communicating that they would do things in certain locations. I know right near General Headquarters in Orillia and Barrie, there was an organic growth of a group that would engage in low-scale civil disobedience on highways. So we certainly saw growth in this regard, and Hendon every day talked about, and these reports tracked what activity was occurring in what locales. And there was an extensive amount, so much so that some things we just didn't look at because it was sort of not below our radar, but below the threshold of what we would engage ourselves in. I know that there was information collected in relation to maritime transportation, so we were concerned about different ports in Vancouver and on the East Coast, and we were certainly concerned about border crossings because we had collected information to that regard.
And let me ask you about this sort of foreseeable future prediction, because a few days earlier, there was the February 4th date in the Hendon report. Now we're February 3rd, the day before, and the report is saying these will continue for the foreseeable future. Why is that?
the grievances still exist, and the people aren't changing, and they're not achieving their goals of ending mandates, and several other factors. So we felt that they would continue. And I'll be honest here too. Like, I have to say, a lot of this stems from pandemic legislation and grievance, but there were a raft of grievances involved here. Some, I would say, is anti-authoritarian. Some may have had to do with firearms legislation. Some had to do with oil and gas prices. There were a multitude of grievances that people possessed. Some was specific to individuals, such as the Prime Minister or the federal government. So there are a multitude of grievances occurring. Some was specific to our Premier Ford.
I won't pull it up, but the Friday, February 4th Hendon report has a section about the protesters gathering intelligence, their own intelligence, and sort of publishing it online. What can you tell us about that?
That's a fairly common event. If I could go back to even the G8 and G20 in Kananaskis and the G8 and G20 in Huntsville area in Toronto, entities of various natures create a security culture and collect information and produce intelligence reports. And that is how they maintain their own security. And there are various skill sets, and I would say the skill sets in this entity were fairly significant, especially with some of the individuals. So they produced intelligence documentation in terms of what they anticipated, law enforcement techniques, et cetera, negotiating processes. So it was something that we were going through.
Okay. I'd like to...
There was also, sorry, I should say one other thing. There was also information collected that some of the individuals involved were looking for quote unquote infiltrators, because of course they would be cognizant, I would think they would be cognizant that there would be undercover operators collecting information during the protest.
I'd like to take you to the Hendon report for Sunday, February 6th, which is OPP 401622. And if we can go down to the assessment section. Paragraphs 4 and 5, so just down a little bit more. I won't read them out, but it talks about support from public officials or other influential figures having an effect on the protests. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that in terms of what you saw from an intelligence perspective.
Yeah, I would say that for any protest of this type, and I mean various types of protests, they're primarily made up of regular citizens, and they're looking for a form of legitimacy. And then in the media, they are presented in very different light depending upon the nature of the media, whether it's news reporting or editorializing. But by and large, they're looking for legitimacy. So, and I'm not casting a judgment on this, but when they receive legitimacy, whether it's an Indigenous issue in Tyendinaga based upon past grievances, residential schools, or whether it's a freedom convoy issue in Ottawa based upon perceptions of civil liberties and constitutional rights, they become emboldened because they feel themselves to be legitimate already. And when they're lent legitimacy, they feel emboldened.
Thank you.
And they communicate to that effect. That's part of the strategy.
I want to take us to the next day's Hendon report, OPP 401623, and under assessment on page 5.
Sorry, I lose track of the date. Okay,
This
the
is
7th.
it's Monday, February 7th. So we're past the sort of second weekend of the protest in Ottawa. And so the assessment, the first paragraph, the situation in Ottawa remains volatile and represents a public safety threat, an officer safety threat, and potentially a national security threat. The available information suggests that the blockade has ample moral, logistical, and financial support to remain in place long term. Why did it use the phrase national security threat?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I anticipated, and it's one that on that day we had a great deal of discussion about. Why? We put in that there was a potential national security threat because of the movement to the borders, and specifically to the Ambassador Bridge. The apparent long-term capacity for the protesters to stay in place in Ottawa, the ongoing calls for actions elsewhere, the events in Coots, and the movement to the Ambassador Bridge, and discussion of the tunnel. The Ambassador Bridge specifically because I believe it has the largest sort of exchange in terms of financial, like a dollar value in our country. So that is why we put that in terms of a potential. I will say, I spoke about that with colleagues from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and with the Integrated National Security Enforcement Team, and they did not see things that reached their threshold in terms of what would be deemed a threat to the security of Canada. So we were an anomaly in that regard, but we phrased it as a potential.
And so you beat me to it, but I'll take you to an email where you reference that. It's OPP 401038. This is an email from yourself to Jim Walker and Brian Barclay, and just after midnight on February 8th. So just after you've published this Hendon report on the 7th. If we could scroll down at the bottom to point number 5. In terms of national security, the wording in Hendon assessment concerned me slightly. I agree with the potential for officer safety and public safety, but INSET and CSIS concur that there are no national security concerns. Confirmed today. If we have access to something they don't, we can meet them to discuss, but I'm not aware of it. And so what is it, again, from your discussions with them, what were their concerns about your use of the word national security threat?
Sorry, okay, I just want to be clear. They weren't concerned about me utilizing it. I wanted to be certain that we were using the best terminology we could in a very fluid situation. So when this information is collected, our analysts are, I use the phrase, drinking from a fire hose in some regards, and trying to produce intelligence under tight timelines. So they came to the determination that there were potential national security threats. I reviewed the report, and we had, Inspectors Barclay and Walker, and I, significant discussions about it, and it's why I reached out to my colleagues. I became content with the phrasing that it was a potential, and that I was also content with their assessment.
Okay. I want to take you to the next day's Hendon report, February 8th, which is OPP 401624. And we'll go to page 4 when we get there, under the assessment section. So the situation in Ottawa remains volatile and represents a public safety threat and an officer safety threat. And then the last sentence in that paragraph, as such, the ongoing series of protests and blockades represents a potential threat to Canada's sovereignty and national security. Is that, can you sort of compare for us the language from the February 7th report to the one here on February 8th?
I think in essence, it means the same thing, that we have a potential concern in terms of sovereignty in our border crossings and our economic integrity in terms of trade, and national security in that regard. It might also have to do with the analytical assessments of threat to reputation by virtue of coverage in the international media of what was transpiring in Canada.
Okay. And do you feel that that assessment was accurate at the time, that it was a potential threat to sovereignty and national security?
I agreed with the fact that it had potential to be so.
If we could pull up OPP 401837. These are meeting minutes. I think they're dated February 11th. I believe the meeting may have occurred a couple of days earlier. This is an early integrated planning cell meeting. Your name is in the attendees. Do you remember attending this meeting?
I've never seen this document. I did have a meeting with the integrated planning cell when it was initiated. So I'm going to say yes. I'm just not familiar with the document.
Okay. And if we could go down
I believe, just to be clear, I was contacted by then Chief Superintendent Party of the Ontario Provincial Police, and he was contacting me together with, I believe, a Chief Superintendent from the RCMP, Lou, and they were in discussions about the creation of a joint planning cell, an integrated planning cell, and I offered to them an intelligence briefing. I believe that's what this is about.
Okay. And if we go down to page 4, there's a something that's attributed to you. It's Superintendent Morris. PLT framework has been excellent in the past. We have a significant portion of this event. If proper messaging and options in the form of negotiation could occur, this could dissipate. Chief Superintendent Party agreed. Meeting with Chief Slowly at noon today, and we'll be stressing the need for a plan and an overview. We need to come to terms with what the intelligence really is versus what is perceived. I want to ask you about that last part, if you remember sort of.
Yeah, so this is a bit difficult because these aren't my notes. Okay, so I was discussing provincial liaison teams, and I believe that they are an absolutely excellent source. They're an excellent aspect to two-way communication in events of this type. So they can communicate the situation to people who are engaging in terms of perhaps what jeopardy they may be in, what consequences they may face, and also lead towards negotiated solutions. So that's a very positive thing that we'd utilized in the past if it's done properly. That was my component of this. In terms of the meeting with Chief Slowly at noon, that's not me. That's Chief Superintendent Party. I know that we discussed the intelligence with Chief Party, and there were other, I'm sorry, I didn't look at the list. I had my entire intelligence management team to give a complete overview. Chief Party was of the opinion that the planning wasn't intelligence-led, and so he wanted to have a discussion of that with Ottawa Police Service.
Okay. If we could go to OPP 401158. This is an email that you sent on the same day, it's on February 10th, the next day. And you've sent it to Mark Patterson. Who is Mark Patterson?
Mark Patterson was the superintendent of the Ottawa Police Service Intelligence Directorate. We were notified of that in January, early January.
Okay, and you've copied Chuck Cox and Brian Barclay of the OPP, and Ken Bryden. Who is he?
Ken Bryden was the inspector of the Ottawa Police Service Intelligence Directorate and reported to Mark Patterson.
Okay. And I don't need you to sort of read out the whole email, but perhaps if the hearing clerk can kind of scroll through and you can skim it. And I just want to ask you why you sent this email at this point in time.
Sorry, my eyes aren't the best. I'm trying to keep up. Yeah, okay, so I began giving, I was requested by Commissioner Creek and Superintendent McDonnell of the OPP to provide intelligence briefings to what were referred to as the Big 12, meaning the Big 12 services of Ontario, the chiefs of police. I did so. And following that briefing, there's parts of this that don't involve me. So I believe Detective Constable Stefan Quinnell of the Ottawa Police Service sent an email to Inspector Barclay of the OPP, and that email stipulated that Chief Slowly wished to have every Hendon report since its inception. And I was surprised by that request because the Ottawa Police Service did have every Hendon report since its inception, and Chief Slowly himself had received every Hendon report since January 1st of 2021, so for over a year. And so we were very, very engaged in a lot of operations and analysis, and I didn't want people to be looking for reports to disseminate for the course of what was almost 2 years at that point when the police service already possessed them. And they weren't relevant. The Hendon reports in February of 2020 were not relevant to the situation at hand. So I was explaining this to Mark Patterson so that he could deal with it internally in the Ottawa Police Service.
And did you understand why someone on your team was being asked to put all this information together?
I referenced Hendon in my report to the Big 12 and gave a background on it, and all of the people who participated, their services were participating in Hendon. It surprised me that we got that request because I would have thought they would have already known and had their reports. So that's why I was very specific in my response and told Mark all the things that had been going on, including providing an excerpt to my invitations to teleconferences that were relating to the issue at hand, the Freedom Convoy.
And Chief Slowly asked you directly for some information at some point. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't have my notebook here, but anyways, I believe it was on February 11th. It was a Friday. I believe it was Friday, February 11th. And so that was a briefing that I provided to the Big 12. Again, I want to be clear on this. I can't tell you how many people were on that call, but they were chiefs of police. There were definitely more than 12. And I had been asked to provide this, and it was, I think it occurred 7 times. So I was asked to provide, I believe I had 5 questions, and they pertained to 4 geographic locales. So the locales were the City of Ottawa, the City of Toronto, City of Windsor, and Sarnia / the 402 just outside of Sarnia in OBP jurisdiction. That was the 4 locales. The questions, to the best I can, I think I should be able to remember it.
I could pull up a document if you'd like.
Okay.
Why don't we do that?
I do recall them.
If we can pull up OPS 3010411. This, I believe, is an email. It's a forward of your email that you ultimately sent answering the question. So if we could just scroll down to the body of your email. I think the next page. There it is. Are these the 5 questions that Chief Slowly asked you to answer?
Yeah, that's correct.
And if we could just scroll down, if we stop there, that he clarified that he wished the answers to be provided by confirmed intelligence, not aspirational information. What did you understand that to mean?
Well, what I understood it to mean is the best information possible, but he was very clear in articulating only confirmed intelligence. And that's problematic in that you receive information, you produce intelligence. Intelligence is not necessarily always factual, it's an assessment. And I certainly cannot provide a confirmation of a quantitative factor about the future. So in terms of, I only want confirmed intelligence of the number of people in a location in the future. Intelligence tradecraft, or any tradecraft, could not possibly provide that.
And had you had this request previously in the last 2 weeks before this, or was this the first time you had faced this request?
No, that was the first time we had the request.
And was it unusual for the chief of police of a sort of different police force to ask you for this kind of information?
Yeah, I've never experienced it before. I found it unusual. And one thing that I perhaps found unusual is that generally the chief of police is trying to ascertain information or intelligence about their jurisdiction. And, you know, the Ontario Provincial Police or the RCMP may be different in that regard, but not about the exact number of protesters on Highway 402 in Sarnia in the future.
And I understand the next day, so that puts us at Saturday, February 12th, you gave a presentation to the OACP. Do you remember that?
Yes. So, yeah, sorry, there are two presentations. So just for clarity, there were a lot of briefings that I was asked to provide. The Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police had formulated a planning entity. Our lead in that regard was Superintendent Mike McDonnell and Superintendent Dan Alakis. So I would provide briefings on what was transpiring in multiple jurisdictions and what I felt would occur in those locations. And the specific purpose of that was that the various police services could then make decisions about the dispersal of uniform resources, be they uniform resources or public order units, soft tack, hard tack in terms of that. So that's the OACP meeting.
Right, and you attended one on the 12th, and I believe Chief Slowly was there, correct?
Yeah, so that meeting occurred later in the evening of the 12th. I know it was set for 1900 hours and it may have been delayed. And that's the so-called Big 12 meeting, which is a different meeting than the OACP.
Okay, and can you tell us about what happened at that meeting?
I was asked by the OPP Commissioner Creek to provide an intelligence overview. I have to say that on that day, for Thursday and Friday, I'm sorry, I'm going by memory, the 10th and 11th, there were multiple priorities. So the convoy protesters or the leadership of several segments were planning to not move the entire protest, but to make a show of a protest in Toronto and specifically at Queen's Park. So I created and my team created a separate collection plan and an operational plan to assist the Toronto Police Service. And it involved multiple entities, I mean police services, because there were multiple rallying points and we were dispersing our intelligence personnel to go to the rallying points to collect the information, to produce the intelligence for Toronto in real time in their incident command center, major event center, et cetera. That protest was to have occurred and did occur on Saturday the 12th. So the meeting you're referring to occurred after that. So I gave an intelligence overview of what was transpiring across the province. Obviously, Toronto, the events in Toronto played a significant component or took up a significant component of that. Chief Slowly was not happy with the briefing or the presentation. He made his displeasure evident and articulated that he didn't like comparisons between Toronto and Ottawa, and then spoke about Hendon, basically about the Ontario Provincial Police not fulfilling their intelligence mandate to assist police services of jurisdiction, and that he and his, I don't want to misspeak, I'm going to say his team, but he referred to a scribe and he referred to a lawyer that were present, which surprised me. I never encountered that before in an intelligence briefing either. Had reviewed the Hendon reports, and there was nothing, I don't know what his word was, so nothing of value or nothing of significance or nothing that could have assisted them. So the meeting, I mean, it was difficult. Our commissioner intervened, and we ended up having a separate discussion between Commissioner, this is all virtual, between Commissioner Creek, myself, and Deputy Commissioner Chuck Cox.
And what was your view of Chief Slowly's assessment of the Hendon reports?
Well, I completely disagree. I'll use the terms inter and legere. I believe we provided, I believe that a discerning read of the intelligence products throughout the fall of 2021 and certainly from the 13th of January in 2022, and then with the teleconferences that Ottawa Police Service participated in, and the intelligence products that had been produced daily since that period of time, leading to, on this date, February 12th, said that there will be a significant event in Ottawa. It will begin on the 28th or 29th of January. It will incorporate large groups of motivated people who are protesting. These are their grievances. It will incorporate large use of commercial motor vehicles, tractor trailers. Their intention is to impede the business of government and to be in the downtown area. We use terminology like gridlock. We said there was no exit strategy and their demands could not be met, and it would be significant, and there would be other calls for resources because there would be other events. I believe I did say to him, there's no golden key. Like, sometimes when people look for a product, an intelligence product, it's like a golden key that will answer absolutely everything. Intelligence is designed to inform decision-making. I believe that our information collected and our intelligence produced from our entire partnership were instrumental in informing decision-making about what would occur. So I disagreed. But I did say that in terms of his displeasure with what he referred to as a comparison of Toronto and Ottawa, one of the issues is sometimes in planning, people fail to appreciate an event that hasn't occurred yet. I call it a deference of the important for the urgent. When Toronto acted, Toronto had the benefit of the experience in Ottawa to say, yeah, this is a big deal. This is really going to happen. So I agree with that. And I did also tell him that he and the Ottawa Police Service were faced with a difficult situation, 100%. I totally agree with that.
I want to ask you about one last document, and then I'll be done, which is the Hendon report from Monday, February 14th, the day the Emergencies Act was invoked. It's OPP 401630. If we can go to page 6, there's a bolded paragraph. The situation in Ontario remains volatile. Protesters and their supporters are unlikely to be significantly deterred by any invocation of the Emergencies Act. The potential for conflict or an act of violence is likely increasing as the Ottawa blockade continues. Why did Hoyb conclude that the act was unlikely to deter the protesters and actually that violence was likely to increase?
From a philosophical or ideological perspective, many of the grievances believe that the legislation that was being passed during COVID-19 was unconstitutional and unjust, and that the restrictions on their freedoms were resultingly unjust. So new legislation being passed was a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, some people on one side of the coin call it a conspiracy theorist. There's a conspiracy theory that they're going to invoke the Emergencies Act. So when the Emergency Act is invoked, it impacts the people who feel that way, and it aggravates their perspective and creates more frustration. So the people who were engaged in the protests did not believe that the Emergencies Act should be invoked, did not believe government should have more powers and police should have more powers. So they are seeing, from their perspective, the correctness of their stance.
Thank you, Superintendent Morris. Those are my questions.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to keep going if you're up to it, and if so, I take it you are up to it? Okay, so we're going to take a 15-minute break so that you can load up with water or whatever and come back and we'll go through the cross-examinations. Okay, 15 minutes.
The commission is recess for 15 minutes. La commission levée pour 15 minutes. Order à d'autres. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay, welcome back. first up is the Ottawa Police Service.
Good evening, Superintendent Morris. How are you?
Good,
I am
thank you.
David Michikowski. I'm a lawyer for the Ottawa Police Service. I understand that the OPP has quite a bit of experience dealing with protests over the years.
Yes, that's correct.
And some of the protests, I take it, would have been successfully handled. Some have resulted in some public criticism of OPP's role.
Yes, that's correct.
For instance, if we go back, Ipperwash and Dudley George were notorious examples of where things went wrong. And then I understand in 2013, the OPP was also subject to much criticism. I'm not saying merited, but criticism for how it responded to the Idle No More protest. Is that right?
I'm not aware of the criticism in relation to I don't know more, but that is certainly possible.
I seem to recall that there was criticism of the OPP for not ending blockades of rail arteries at the time, and injunctions had been issued. Is that coming back to you?
I do recall that criticism, yes.
And as I recall, the OPP commissioner went on YouTube and said it can be sometimes difficult for the public to understand why the police don't always immediately take enforcement action.
And I recall that, and I certainly understand that as well.
And you would agree with that as well, I take it?
I agree that the events are difficult. I agree that it would be difficult for the public to understand what actions the police do or do not take. Yes.
And in some situations, the right approach may be to not take immediate enforcement action, but for instance, to use the national framework for protests and investigate and lay charges after the event where appropriate.
And that may be the appropriate approach, yes.
And so, that may be because immediate enforcement can sometimes be dangerous in terms of the public and officer safety.
And certainly that's a consideration. That's a possibility, yes.
And immediate action can inflame or incite or lead to even death in some cases, correct?
Yes, it could, as in it occurred in Ipperwash, yes.
Am I correct that based on the OPP's significant experience, they've learned some valuable lessons and have developed some expertise in
Yes, I agree
protests?
with that, yes.
And much of that expertise comes from the experiences they've had. And I take it after a protest is handled by the OPP, there's probably a review and an analysis of what went well and what did not.
That's correct, yes.
And then you build on that experience to address policing protests in the future to hopefully do it better.
That's correct.
And the situation in Ottawa, we've heard, was unique and unprecedented, are words that we've seen. And you agree with that, correct?
I agree that there were elements of this protest in Ottawa that were unprecedented. The financial component, the travel. I agree with elements of that were unprecedented, yes.
And a demonstration of this size involving large vehicles, which became an occupation and resulted in upheaval and trauma to the community. There's no other municipal police service in Canada that's experienced something like that, is there?
I don't know that I can answer that necessarily. I can say this. I do believe there were elements that were unprecedented, as you said. I do believe there have been attempts to do things like this for shorter periods of time, as in Toronto on February 12th. But I definitely agree that the longevity and some of the tactics utilized are unprecedented, and the financing.
And we're going to be hearing from some other witnesses, and you can tell me if you would agree with that, that planning for major events can be a very labor-intensive job. Is that fair?
It's fair that planning can be labor-intensive, yes.
And so sometimes months of planning take place with consultation with many experts in different areas in preparation for an event.
It's true that months could be required in relation to certain events. It's also true that circumstances present themselves that require more immediacy in terms of planning. The G8, G20 is an example of the months of planning. Other examples illustrate themselves and don't permit that.
Right. The first mention of the Freedom Convoy, I think, was on the January 13th Hendon, is that correct?
That's the first production of intelligence from the Ontario Provincial Police, yes.
And then 15 days later, it began to arrive in Ottawa on the 28th of January.
That's correct.
And so there wasn't a lot of advance notice.
No, that's true. There was 15 days. Yeah.
And then the January 13th, I'm not going to pull it up in order to save some time, but I think you're pretty comfortable with it. But if you're not, please let me know. The January 13th Hendon report did not provide a lot of information because not a lot of information was known at that time.
It provided our best assessment based upon the known information, and it stimulated further collection.
Right. So there was no indication in that report of the size of the convoy.
I'm not able to remember the wording specifically. I mean, you'd have it in the assessment, but I honestly, I don't want to say what it says in the assessment.
Okay. We have it marked so we can look at it. Do you recall it saying that there was no indication of what the convoy would do when it arrived?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's something that remained true until it came to fruition.
In fact, in your summary that you prepared of the Hendon reports, you said the details of the convoy on January 13 were scant.
Okay.
Can I ask, please, if you could turn up OPP 00348? And if you scroll down a bit, there's an email from you to Deputy Commissioner Cox at 6:30 on February 14th.
Yes.
And if we go to the second page of that email, is that the full page? Thanks. And so the second last paragraph, I just want to read that to you.
Yep.
I should also mention there was a serious complication in relation to these activities. These individuals and entities are not, for the most part, participating in the realm of criminal activity. Most from Vancouver to Ottawa have engaged, as they said they would, in the lawful sphere. The arrests from Windsor to Ottawa illustrate this. So the balance of civil liberties and public safety crime prevention, not to mention proactive intelligence targeting, is a sensitive one, especially in these politicized times. And you agree with that? You wrote that, correct?
Yes, I agree.
And so the first real reference to the convoy, where we have some more information coming to Ottawa, is in the January 20th Hendon report, I believe you said.
That's the first, that is the next provision of a written intelligence document. In the interim, there had been communication back and forth between the Provincial Operations Intelligence Bureau and Ottawa Police Service intelligence personnel.
And so on the January 20th one, again, without turning it up, you would agree with me, I take it, that there was some information that turned out not to come to fruition. And so I can give you some examples if you want.
Sure. Do you mind pulling it up?
So I'll give you this example. And one of the things one of the things it did say was that it would almost certainly disrupt the movement of vehicular traffic. And that obviously is true. And that's true about most protests, correct?
True, yeah.
And then it said some participants may attempt to disrupt the business of government at the provincial and federal level by blocking access to Parliament. You remember that?
Yes.
That didn't happen in Ottawa because the work of Parliament went on throughout the convoy, correct?
I think that they did impede the activity of government by virtue of their presence, and I think that led to significant discussion about the workings of Parliament and some security concerns. I think they also attempted to impede activity in Toronto in relation to Queen's Park on February 5th and 12th.
Right, I'm sorry, my question wasn't clear. I'm talking about Ottawa. The work of Parliament continued, correct? Parliament sat during that period.
Okay, I can't speak to whether any of the members of Parliament felt impeded. So, yeah, so
Another thing noted at that time was that some individuals from the United States may join, and that appeared occasionally in Hendon reports. That didn't occur either, did it?
I can't honestly say. I mean, I guess if there was any American citizen that participated, I guess that would be true. I can say that the impact and influence that was feared possibly by some American activists never occurred.
And most of the information as of January 20th was that the protesters were aiming at a lawful and peaceful event. And there's no, is that true?
Yes.
And there was no indication in the January 20th report that the trucks would end up in residential neighborhoods and that they'd break noise bylaws. That wasn't part of the Hendon report, was it?
Yeah, to be honest, we don't concentrate, I mean, generally speaking, in intelligence on bylaw infractions, although that was an important point here. I do believe that it spoke to impeding the business of government in the downtown core and business.
Right.
We did not make specific reference to residential areas.
Right, and so there was no reference to trucks idling their engines or having hot tubs or bouncy castles or harassing residents or engaging in antisocial behavior.
Yeah, it's a subjective term, but no, there's no reference to that, no.
And there was an indication, though, that although it was planned to be peaceful, there was the possibility of lone actors or small groups engaging in activity that present public safety threats.
Yes, that was certainly a possibility.
And the possibility that lone actors and small fringe groups would present public safety issues was in fact addressed by the Ottawa Police and the OPP in preparation, correct? You had POU units here?
Yes, I mean, I have to say, from my perspective, the proactive handling of those possibilities was done through intelligence operations. The presence of a public order unit would respond to the outcome coming to fruition.
And the threats to public safety, fortunately, didn't materialize on that first weekend. Is that right?
Yeah, I would concur with that.
And although obviously very inconvenient for residents, that first weekend was calm, no serious threats or acts of serious violence.
Correct.
The January 20th Hendon report, it was noted, was difficult to complete comprehensively because it involved a wide array of individuals with multiple motivations and plans that were loosely formed.
That's correct. So I just want to point out on that, there were multiple affinity groups and multiple individuals, multiple grievances, and we were trying to address that and did through the creation of tactical intelligence reports that were completed later in that week and provided to the Ottawa Police Service.
And so another Hendon report on January 22nd that I believe you referenced earlier notes that the number of potential participants in Ottawa was unknown, and I believe what we see on it is that online claims of the size are of unknown reliability.
Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, when we follow social media, it will be of unknown reliability. We tried to mitigate that unknown factor with juxtaposing it in the context, and we came to the determination that there was significant support.
And the January 22nd Hendon report in the assessment section also notes that an intelligence gap at that point is the number of participants, correct?
That's correct. And I should say, as part of intelligence tradecraft, that is always a gap right up until the event actually occurs, because we would never know the exact numbers.
And the January 22nd Hendon report has a section headed Tactical Considerations. And I see in that section, I don't know if this, you recall this, that one organizer there claimed 1 million individuals and 10,000 trucks would attend. Do you remember that?
I do remember reading that.
That didn't happen, did it?
No.
January 26th, so that's another Hendon report. That's 2 days before the arrival, am I right?
Yep.
And that has a section called the seriousness of the threats and lists a number of points in terms of the seriousness. None of those threats mention the horns or the idling, open fires, harassment of residents. That's not one of the threats, is it?
It's not listed as one of the threats, no.
And again, it talks about the potential presence of individuals who espouse fringe ideologies and have access to weapons. And that too wasn't a problem in Ottawa, correct?
That's correct. Well, I should comment on that. In terms of, it's a subject, weapons? No. In terms of being discerned as such? No. Presence of people with fringe views? I would say there were people present with fringe views, depending upon your determination of fringe.
And I believe that Hendon report indicates, so 2 days before, and it's, I believe in bold, that Project Hendon has not identified any concrete, specific, or credible threats with regard to the convoy.
That is accurate, true.
And the concern about the heavy machinery, that heavy machinery wasn't used for any destructive purposes in Ottawa, was it?
Not that I'm aware of. That would be best posed to the Ottawa Police Service. I just
And
want to
so-
point out, I was involved in the production of strategic intelligence and providing a best assessment to inform decision-making. In terms of some of the questions you're asking, in terms of the use of, I think that's best to the operational commanders from the City of Ottawa, or sorry, from the Ottawa Police Service.
And if we look at January 26 again, even 2 days before the arrival, we still don't have any good indications, and I'm not being critical of the intelligence, of the numbers and the length of the stay, correct?
Well, words such as significant in terms, I mean, the numbers to me become, if it's significant and there are large numbers, then perhaps the actual quantity is not as important. But no, we didn't mention the length of stay, but we did certainly say that we felt it would be long-term based upon the fact that they were going to stay until their demands were met, and we felt they couldn't be.
And the OPP and the Ottawa Police Service did work together from even before the first convoy arrived, and had POU units in Ottawa cooperated with each other.
So we worked together in Hendon with the Ottawa Police Service, and that was sort of my purview of responsibility. In terms of public order, et cetera, that would be a question that should be asked to Superintendent Abrams in terms of the OPP operations.
Okay. I didn't see any memos or briefings or emails from the OPP to the OPS saying, what are you doing? What are your plans? You're not aware of such memos, are you?
I'm not aware of the memos, but I wouldn't be in my capacity as the intelligence leader.
And the OPP, I take it, knows that if Ottawa Police needs assistance, it's likely to call on the OPP because of their size. You have a very large police service.
First, yes.
And OPS has, OPP has PLTs who were activated for this protest.
Yes, that's true.
And OPS also had PLTs who were activated before the protest as well, correct?
That is not, I'm not certain how PLT was utilized in the Ottawa Police Service.
Okay. And if I look at the Hendon report of January 27th, the day before, I still see that indication in bold that there's no concrete, specific, or credible threat identified, correct?
That's correct. And to be quite blunt, you're going to see that throughout, because There was no, apart from the public order event that would occur and be significant and of longstanding, there was no specific intelligence about a specific action, i.e. an attack on Parliament, an attack on anything else.
If you could please turn up OPP 00815, page 7.
Your time is just about out on my clock, so if you could try and wrap up.
Sure.
Sorry, can you repeat the number, Councillor?
OPP 00815. Thank you. If you could please turn to page 7. And under the section assessment. So this is the January 28th report. So January 28th being the date that they're here. And so what we see in the first paragraph is the available information indicate that the protesters plan to remain in Ottawa at least until February 4th, 2022, correct?
Yes.
And then we see we continue to identify indicators to support at least some protesters remaining beyond the weekend of 2022-01-2930. So in other words, some of them are going to remain past 2930, and some of them are going to remain until February 4th, correct?
I want to be clear on this. We felt it would be of long standing. The reason that February 4th was cited was because there was a specific piece of information that they would be there until at least February 4th. But it does not preclude the long-standing significant event that we said that would occur until the demands were met, which they wouldn't be.
And finally, my final point is I understand that the OPP provided some assistance to Toronto when they had the protest occurring in Toronto the following week, correct?
Yes, so there were two. I'm sorry, is the one on February 12th, which was the Saturday, February 12th?
Yes, and there was another one as well.
There was one on February 5th as well.
Right. And so when I looked at your notes, I saw that you, in fact, attended meetings with Toronto prior to the protest arriving in Toronto. Do you recall that?
Yeah, virtual meetings with the people in intelligence to set up our collection and our information and intelligence routing to assist them in their plans.
Right. And you referenced what happened in Ottawa as a learning experience.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Next is the convoy organizers.
Hello, sir. My name is Brennan Miller. I'm counsel for the Convoy or Freedom Corp, which is an entity that represents the protesters that were in Ottawa on January and February of 2022. I just have a few questions for you. Okay. First, again, thank you for your service, and thank you very much for your forthright testimony earlier. Just on something you spoke about in your evidence in chief, you spoke about the demand of protesters, and those demands would simply not be met. I take it that by that you mean the demand for the removal of vaccine or COVID mandates. Is that correct?
In the main, yes, there were a multitude of demands, but those were some significant ones, and for the federal government to drop some of their regulations and mandates, and we didn't feel that would be met, yes.
Yes, right. And these questions are going to be, I'm you're going to be able to know exactly where I'm going, so I'm just going to be blunt. You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of espionage or in support of espionage. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of sabotage or anything in support of sabotage.
That's correct.
You didn't see anything in the evidence, any evidence in the intelligence of any form of foreign influenced activities within or relating to Canada that involved the threat to any person.
I saw media accounts, yes. I saw no information collected or intelligence produced in that regard, no. To support that, no.
Now, for my following question, when I say serious violence against a person, you'll understand I mean violence that would result in serious personal injury, okay? You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat of a use of acts of serious violence against persons for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state.
So yes, I know where you're going, and I want it to be fair to my colleagues in planning. I saw online rhetoric. I saw information on social media. I saw assertions of that type of activity. Information. I'm aware of no intelligence that was produced that would support concern in that regard.
Thank you. And now for my next question, when I say serious violence against property, you'll understand I mean violence against property of the nature such as arson or destruction, a bomb, that sort of thing, okay? You didn't see any evidence in the intelligence of activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat of use of acts of serious violence against property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada or a foreign state.
So again, not to be contradictory because I'm just trying to be fulsome. Our role is crime prevention, law enforcement, assistance to victims, public order, and emergency management. Therefore, in relation to the things you're discussing, we collected all the information, which some information asserted attempts at that. So we did see that and had to consider that. Did we have any credible intelligence that that would occur? No.
Thank you. And you touched on in your oral evidence about the labeling of someone as being an extremist. You said that that term you have a lot of problems with, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that for me.
I can. Sorry, where did I say I have problems with that?
You said just in your evidence in chief.
Okay. So the word extremism does not have a description in law. Section 83 of the Criminal Code speaks to terrorist offenses, which possibly could be synonymous with extremism. Sections 318, 319, and 320 of the Criminal Code speak to hate-motivated crimes, advocation of genocide, etc. Other sections of the Criminal Code, such as Section 430, speak to acts against religious property that could be deemed to be extremist. I have problems with the term because everyone has a subjective belief as to what extremism means. At the low end and banal end, it means someone I disagree with, and I find that problematic. As a working definition for myself, I utilize extremism and I try to premise it in law by somebody who would advocate and utilize violence to achieve their goals. And they could be motivated politically, ideologically, religiously, etc.
Right. And I take it that in practice, if the federal government's intelligence apparatus or law enforcement sees a legitimate, credible threat, as we just discussed, they would let you know about it, correct?
We work with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service on a daily basis. We have a provincial anti-terrorism section that is integrated with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. We are integrated with the Integrated National Security Enforcement Team and have members on that. That is their threshold, and as you've cited, Section Part 2 of the CSIS Act in terms of the threats to Canada. I communicated with my colleagues in INSET in Ottawa, INSET in Toronto, CSIS in Toronto, CSIS in Ottawa, they participated in the Hendon calls. I believe that I would have been informed. And in terms of those delineations, I guess I'll know more at the end of these hearings, but I received no information in relation to those, the probability of that activity.
Right, and of course, the intelligence apparatus in Canada, they're not technically law enforcement. They provide information, and it is the OPP and the RCMP and the Ottawa Police Service who would carry out any law enforcement aspects with respect to any threat domestically, correct?
Yeah, the O'Connor Commission spoke to that in the Arar inquiry.
Yes.
CSIS collects, advises, retains for government, security intelligence. We act on criminal intelligence and translate that into evidence for law enforcement action.
Right, and the federal government would always tell you about these things because they don't want to have any Canadians and individuals harmed, right? They want you to protect them.
We have a great relationship. I'm not trying to skirt your question. We have a great relationship with intelligence entities. I know that CSIS will present, as will the RCMP. We have a good relationship, and I believe that I would be informed. But I also believe that there would be instances where activity is occurring within that sphere that I may not be advised of because it may not be within my purview of the Police Services Act and criminal intelligence, international in scope, perhaps.
To your knowledge, have you been advised by any of those actors that you have not been informed of everything?
Have I been advised by those actors that I have not been informed of something?
Yes.
No.
Thank you. Now, dealing with the issue of lone wolf attackers, can you agree that the last lone wolf attack in the Capitol was on October 22nd, 2014, when Michael Zaf Bibu attacked Parliament with a firearm? Is that correct?
I remember the events, and I would attribute that to what I refer to as an independent asymmetric threat. I don't want to say that that's the last event just because I don't want to misspeak. I am aware of other events, but they weren't that I'm aware of in the National Capital Region.
Now, can you agree that following that attack, lessons were learned on how law enforcement intelligence agencies would gather intelligence with respect to lone wolf attackers?
Yes, I believe that lessons were learned. I believe that resources were increased. I believe that cooperation and collaboration was enhanced. I will say this as a caveat. An independent asymmetric threat, a lone wolf, is the largest concern for somebody in a position such as mine or other people who appear before you, because we rely upon the collection of information to produce intelligence. And in the instance of an independent asymmetric threat, the circle of trust may be one. And that is a very difficult environment in which to succeed.
Right. And those lessons that were learned from that attack, they were incorporated within the intelligence gathering apparatus, both at the OPP and federally, correct?
Yes, certainly. I mean, that's an area where the age of social media can assist us, because in many examples of lone wolves, as you refer to, those are preceded by indicators of activity. So that is of assistance, and that is something that the Provincial Operations Intelligence Bureau engages in.
Right. And a lone wolf attack does not need a protest in order to be carried out, does it?
It does not require one, no.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Next is for former Chief Slowly.
Superintendent, I'm Tom Curry. I want to start at the end, recommendations. The Commissioner has the task of considering whether there are recommendations that he can make concerning the issues that we're here about, Emergencies Act demonstrations of the kind. One of the things that Chief Slowly, I anticipate, will say to the Commissioner is that there, in his experience, are what he would describe as structural deficits in gathering intelligence between agencies. You've mentioned them: CSIS, RCMP, OPP, other law enforcement and security agencies. Just stopping there, do you agree that the commissioner should consider a recommendation that will enhance a national security framework for intelligence now?
Can I give you my answer in two parts?
Yes?
Okay. I would always agree with any recommendation such as that to review what transpired and to review how we can improve. I myself have done that already in relation to these events. I will say that I honestly believe that we do have a high degree of collaboration in this province and in this country, and we do have trusted partnerships, and we do produce credible intelligence. It is not perfect, and it can always be improved, and I would gladly participate in any entity of that sort.
Right, thank you. One of the things as well that I expect you'll also be able to help the commissioner with is this. Am I correct that Hendon and the work that your intelligence bureau does arose in order to fill a gap that you saw in the way that you described, and I don't have time to go back through that history. Am I correct? That's how it arose, to fill a gap?
I think that's a correct assessment.
Right.
I just want to give you there are issues we face as a law enforcement community proactively that are broader than our jurisdictions, and galvanizing and collaborating can assist us in that regard.
And in that respect, I haven't met someone from an agency that doesn't want more funding, but am I correct that a recommendation from the commissioner to consider the funding question to support those initiatives as the issues have arisen that you have identified would be helpful?
That's difficult ground for me. I can't speak for the Ottawa Police Service. I can say that I'm
I'm
happy with.
going to stop you. Not
Okay.
Ottawa.
Okay.
Ontario Provincial Police.
Okay. That would be for other people to consider. I do believe that we had the resources that were required. I'm speaking of intelligence, to engage proactively and strategically to ascertain what would transpire.
The coalescing, back to these events now, please, the coalescing of these disparate groups that you described and the financing that you described that you had seen for the first time, you described those as unprecedented in your experience, correct?
Aspects of it. The fundraising, yes. The issues, the grievances were different. So there are certainly unprecedented components of it.
Fair. And in that respect, just focusing on the funding alone, do you accept that represents a paradigm shift in protest and dissent of the kind that you're experienced with?
It presents a logistical change in the capacity of entities to fundraise. But I will say that we had already experienced that in Mackenzie Meadows' occupation and had approached entities such as GoFundMe to take steps in relation to that in lines with their terms of agreement.
Right. Mackenzie Meadows, if I understand that protest or occupation was a single development parcel. That's a First Nations or Indigenous dispute, land dispute. Is that correct?
It's roughly, yeah. It's complex, but that's accurate.
Complex. And the coalescing of on a national scale, people coming from across the country to one destination, that's a first.
Yeah, it's different for sure. 100%. I agree.
Now, my colleague for the Ottawa Police Service has already reviewed some details of the Hendon reports. I don't have the time to go back through them, but suffice it to say, it was not your purpose in describing the Hendon reports to provide operational planning. It is an input into operational planning, correct?
Yeah, sorry. I think I understand. Our purpose in the strategic intelligence reports of Hendon was to inform decision-making. Part of that decision-making is police operational planning to prepare.
Understood.
But I just have to say that there were other components once the event becomes a reality, then the tactical intelligence collection through different investigative techniques and the information acquired by that activity lends itself to more operational and enhanced operational planning.
Right. So, for example, we won't see in a Hendon report or any of those other documents to which you've referred any advice to the Ottawa Police Service in the days ahead of the convoy that it should close specific roads, correct?
That's correct.
That it should divert traffic in a particular fashion.
That's correct.
And the OPP itself, so far as you know, Intelligence Bureau didn't direct OPP operations in any part of the province to intercept convoy protesters at the border of Manitoba or Quebec, correct?
The OPP Intelligence Bureau did not advise entities to do that. That's
Right.
correct. I just want to say that in the Ontario Provincial Police, like within a police service, intelligence is part of a major incident management group where when things impact our jurisdiction, we have discussions of that. But no, we certainly, as an intelligence bureau, as a Hendon, did not act to advise Ottawa what they should do.
Nor your own team at the. Why was the convoy not intercepted at the Manitoba border? Many people have asked that question in hindsight, of course. Why not?
I think the answer there, where there was no reasonable grounds to believe that they were committing a criminal offense at the time.
Right.
They were in transit, and we were collecting information for that purpose. They were in transit, and they were engaging in a lawful way. In fact, that was impressed upon us by the information collection.
Right. And that remained true as a convoy protester, individually or collectively, came into the border of the city of Ottawa, correct?
And I would agree with that assessment. And also the intelligence said that there would not be an event, a public order event, until they entered the city of Ottawa.
Right. My colleague has already dealt with this, but many of the Hendon reports, the 25th, my friends for the commission took you to one document on the 25th and showed you a line or two. But in that report, it refers to what is likely to be a 3-day event. There are a number of references that pointed that way, correct?
I don't accept that. I don't recall any information which would lead to the induction that this will only be a 3-day event. We believed, and our belief only became more enhanced as time went on, that it would be a longer event. I do know that February 4th, that came from a piece of information, but in all of our discussions and my read of the intelligence is this will be a significant event and it will be an event of long standing. And there were also convoys arriving, leaving, et cetera, with a great deal of alteration.
I don't have time to take you to it, but later look at the 25th.
Okay.
Can I show the witness, please, OPP 50 or 40 4348? You see this now, 27th of January. Do you recognize this situational report?
Sorry, I actually don't. I don't know if it's the color scheme. Is there something at the top?
It's an OPP. Yeah, well, it's an OPP document, and maybe.
I think this
I
is a
don't know
provincial
whether we can
liaison
scroll
team
up and see
document.
something different,
Yeah.
but do you recognize this as a situational report from your police service?
I'm sorry, it's the first document that I've seen that I don't recognize as such. It may be, I've never seen this before, and it may be a provincial, I'm just going to read. So I recognize it as an OPP document.
There you go, just stop
Okay.
there. It
So
looks
it's an
like
East Region document, okay.
Okay, you got it. Can you scroll back up now, please? Thank you. I want to draw your attention, please, to the, it's got to be about the 8th bullet point, begins Ottawa Police Service
Yep.
has developed a robust plan that would allow for capacity to accommodate up to 3,000 commercial vehicles. There are a number of other things there, but that colleagues of yours in the OPP, different group, no doubt,
Yep.
had access clearly to the plans that the Ottawa Police Service had described, correct?
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I spoke incorrectly. Scott Semple, Inspector Semple, who's referenced here, and Superintendent Abrams, who I believe will be here tomorrow, They would be aware of this, and I'm not trying to say there wasn't a plan. My engagement as an intelligence professional wouldn't lead me to be engaged in that.
Understood. So to put it this way, if OPP had an issue with the plan that the Ottawa Police Service was pursuing to allow the protesters to protest, then it would have spoken up, you would expect.
I can speak to this document. If Scott Semple felt the plan was robust, that's what he articulated here. Yeah.
He's a good, experienced.
He's a critical incident commander and an inspector in the OPP and detachment commander.
Got it. Oh, could I show the witness, please, OPP 401007? Just while this is coming up, you have a Deputy Commissioner, Cox, C-O-X,
That's correct.
and you work with him.
That's correct.
Is your bureau report up through his command?
He is the commander of the Investigations Organized Crime Command, and I am one of the bureaus that reports to him.
Thank you. Look at this, please. Scroll down if you would, Madam Registrar or Clerk. 28th, did you see it, 28th January?
Yep.
So here we are on is that the Friday? To you from him, Pat. Convoy protest is the subject. There's been great collaboration amongst our intelligence bureaus and units, as well as with our policing partners along the route to Ottawa. Established integration and cooperation, all those police services,
Yep.
including Ottawa, along with the planning undertaken by the OPS, have positioned us well to maintain safety and security throughout the weekend. Please extend my gratitude, etc. And you responded to that. Please just scroll up, show the witness. I won't read it all, but you express your gratitude and you share the thanks with your team, correct?
Yes.
Clearly, the Deputy Commissioner thought this was going to be a weekend event, didn't he?
I can't speak to that exactly. I think that may be the case. I think that he had a discussion, I'm going from an independent recollection, with other police services, including Ottawa, and he got a lot of positive feedback, and he sent that email. I think that that's what happened.
No, great. I accept that the Hinnon reports provide very important intelligence, and Chief Slowly will confirm that. But in terms of what put it this way, at that time, Superintendent, you didn't say to him, the plan's great for the weekend, but after that, we're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I'm just sorry. I'm just going to have a quick.
You can scroll down if
sorry.
you wish.
Is it my comments further our analytical?
Yes.
I made it.
Him to you, you to him.
Okay, sorry. I'm just looking. I didn't mention weekend. I didn't mention any timing in my email.
Fair enough.
Sorry, can you go to? That's what I was checking for. And I see that Deputy Cox mentions that it should maintain safety and security throughout the weekend. Yes, and that's what he said. I accept that. I didn't make any comment in relation to time sensitivity.
Thank you. Just the last thing then, if I can. You received a request from Chief Slowly for Hendon information. You told the Commissioner about
Yep.
that. And at the same time, or just ahead of that, actually, you received another communication, this time from someone who reports to Chief Slowly, named Patterson. You've described him already, Mark Patterson. I think he's an inspector.
He's a superintendent.
Superintendent.
Yep.
And he told you you are about to get a response, or you are about to get a request from Chief Slowly, or a bunch of questions from Chief Slowly. Don't respond to them. Do you recall that? I can show you your notes if
I do.
it helps you.
Yeah, I remember. Sorry, I just want to be clear. So the requests from Chief Slowly, and I'm speaking to the 4 locations, the 5 questions, that came on the 11th. I believe that the comments you're referring to, and I do remember them, came on the 13th, and that had to do with the request to appear before the Ottawa Police Services Board.
Thank you.
So they're 2 different factors.
Fair enough. So thank you for that. You were asked by Chief Slowly to come and brief the Police Services Board on the 15th, correct?
That's correct.
And of course, he resigned before that presentation and it was adjourned.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for orienting me to that. What was unusual, you agree with me, was that a superintendent of the Ottawa Police Service told you that you were about to be invited to that Police Services Board meeting to give a briefing with the chief and that you should not attend, correct?
It was unusual. I mean, to be blunt, the entire circumstance was unusual. It's unusual to be asked as the head of intelligence for the OPP to brief the Ottawa Police Services Board. That's point one. And then to be followed up with the next day, I think, I'm sorry, I don't recall her name, Christiane, I think it was the lawyer for the Ottawa Police Services Board that provided the email. And I know that Superintendent Patterson felt that we, the OPP, should not be doing that because that should be the responsibility of the Ottawa Police Service Intelligence Directorate. And that is the entire situation is unusual, yes.
So, I mean, I take it you didn't decline the invitation to go to the Police Services Board when Chief Slowly asked you?
So Chief Slowly asked verbally in the meeting, and he asked me together when I was with my commissioner and deputy commissioner. The formal invitation came the next day on the Sunday morning. When I received the invitation, I didn't respond at first. I discussed it with Deputy Commissioner Cox and Commissioner Creek, and we agreed.
To attend?
We agreed to attend.
Yes. So as unusual as that might have been, you agreed to attend.
Yep.
And then you get a call from Superintendent Patterson saying, Chief Slowly is, and I'm reading you from your notes. I'll show you them if you need to be refreshed. I'm just in the interest of time. Chief Slowly is possibly trying to pin this on the OPP and the lack of intelligence. That's what Superintendent Patterson told you, right?
That's correct.
And did you report that to, I know you reported that to your own command. Do you know whether that information was ever shared with anybody at the Ottawa Police Service about what Superintendent Patterson was suggesting?
I spoke about that with Deputy Cox and Commissioner Creek. That too was unusual. Not that I spoke with it, but that it occurred. I do not know if that was discussed by them with Chief Slowly.
Right. I mean, a significant undermining of a command officer to have a superintendent speak about that, isn't it?
I found it unusual. I will say that. I understand the desire to have the OPS intelligence brief the OPS Police Services Board. I found it unusual. To be honest, from the 11th, 12th, and 13th, 14th, and 15th, there was a lot that transpired that was unusual in relation to our integration and relationship.
Inappropriate? Can I have that at least? What Superintendent Patterson did was inappropriate.
And perhaps it's unusual for certain.
I'll leave it. Thank you.
Okay, next, call on the Ottawa Coalition.
Good evening, Mr. Commissioner. Emily Tamman for the Ottawa Coalition of Residents and Businesses, and our questions have been asked and answered. Thank you.
Next, the City of Ottawa.
Good evening, Superintendent. We also have no additional questions to those that have been put to you so far. Thank you.
Pressures on the Government of Canada.
Good evening, Superintendent.
Good evening.
My name's Donnery Nygaard. I'm Counsel for the Government of Canada. I just have a couple of brief questions for you. When my friend from the Commission was discussing with you your January 29th Hendon report, you talked about, and this is right at the beginning, obviously, of the protest, and you talked about the fact that there had been no criminal activity as the convoy moved across the country, but, and I'm not going to quote you directly because I'm not that good a note taker, but something to the effect of, but when a plan meets a counter plan, you don't know what to expect, and that these kinds of events attract others with other agendas, including lone wolves. Does that roughly accord with your recollection of what you said?
That's roughly, and can I just comment on that?
Absolutely.
Just in intelligence tradecraft, I find it's a bit like financial advice. You always want exactly what's going to happen in the future. And we like to say that a plan never survives contact with the enemy. So it's impossible to expect that it will be exactly like that. So I just say that as context for what you said, but I agree with what you said.
Yes, and And what I wanted to ask you about that, because one of my other friends said that, asked you the question that a protest is not necessary for a lone wolf attack. But I take it from those comments you made about what can happen when these groups come together, that an event such as this that brings all these groups together can increase the likelihood or provide more opportunity for a lone wolf attack. Would that be
I agree with that assessment.
Can we have document OPP 401837, please? One of my friends took you to this document earlier. It was, you said you hadn't seen it before. It was the notes from the integrated planning cell on February 11th that you attended. And just so I'm understanding correctly, this was a briefing that you were giving on the intelligence that you had collected in relation to these events?
Sorry, can you just go up to the very top? I just want to make sure. So I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit uncertain because it isn't my document, but I do recognize the names and I do know what the integrated planning cell is. And I was contacted by Chief Party and others who are participating, and they had said what their purpose was and what their integration was and what they were trying to achieve. And we arranged to have an intelligence briefing. I'm thrown off slightly because it says start time 0700, and I'll be blunt. I got an invitation to a meeting that ran the entire day. I remember being confused by that because I didn't know when I was required to provide my briefing, which I believe I provided at either 0900 or 0930. Okay. So that is why I'm saying what I'm saying. And we provided a briefing on everything, and I had all of the managers there to provide the different aspects, provincial, Ottawa, all the different areas that were ongoing.
So if we scroll down just a little bit so you can see where it says minutes and then it says that you're speaking, correct?
Yep.
And if we scroll on to the next page, just few lines up from that redaction, it says, in terms of Ottawa convoy, since they started on 24th of January, there have been very few criminal acts. Yesterday, there was an increase in hostility, antagonism, anti-police, anti-establishment sentiment. And then if we go down to the next 2 bullet points, this situation is incredibly volatile, which may have national security implications. And then the next bullet point.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're not following?
I'm just trying to. No, I'm just trying to find where we are.
So this situation is incredibly volatile. And then 2 lines down, there are extremist groups, Diagolon involved, and Farfada is a QC-based group. So just a couple of questions for you on this. I assume that you were telling this group all of this information because this was based on the intelligence you had gathered.
Okay, so the difficulty with this for me is these aren't my notes. Yeah. And it's consistent with what we told Chief Slowly in relation to his questions. Everybody was asking about extremism. We weren't seeing much evidence of it. The group Diagolon, in my experience, they are an extremist entity. They hold extremist views. Farfada is a group that until this event, I was not familiar with. And I was informed by the Sûreté du Québec that they were not a violent group, although they were opposed to the pandemic mandates, et cetera, et cetera. So I referenced that Diagolon and Farfada were 2 entities, and that Farfada was geographically situated in a specific area, I believe Rouleau and Sussex, and that we had people on ground ascertaining intent, motivation, individuals, mood, sentiment, et cetera. Okay. That is my recollection of what I was providing.
So maybe I'll just back up for a moment. Is from your recollection, is what's here, or at least the parts that I took you to, is that from your recollection an accurate recording of what you would have told this group amongst other things?
I think generally, yes. I may have is synonymous with potential national security implications, and that spoke to issues beyond Ottawa. I was talking about the situation at a global level.
Yes.
And the increasing volatility was there were points in Ottawa Police Service, I remember Ken Bryden, the inspector, talking about this. There were points when information came back from people on the ground speaking to joviality and congeniality, and there were points when it became more aggressive and egregious. And this specific location was a location where things were more egregious, and it was the collection of our officers on scene that volatility was escalating. And I remember very specifically, it had to do with the issuance of a provincial offense notice where people became aggrieved and there was a verbal exchange.
And I don't think, well, this is February 11th, so you would not have been aware of it yet. But in addition, if there was at one point some arrests made in Coutts, Alberta, which you asked about.
Yes.
And that was also informing what was going on in Ottawa.
Yep. So to be fair on that, when the arrests occurred, we took multiple steps to acquire the information, specifically, as I discussed with the former council, to see what is the impact, what is the connection, et cetera. We determined, we got the information from the RCMP. I spoke with the Assistant Commissioner, I believe Assistant Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner Mark Flynn, and then with the person leading the investigation, and we determined that there was very little connection to Ottawa, and that therefore our assessment was there would be very little impact, and there was not.
And then lastly, I want to take you to OPP 401783. This is the timeline document that you refer to in your statement.
Oh, okay. Yep.
And I understand from your statement that although this was mostly written by an analyst, it was something that you approved the entire document.
That's correct.
And I just want to take you to page 3.
Can I just say that this document was produced, I can't be entirely specific, it was produced for our Commissioner Carrick for his presentation or testimony, I'm not sure which, to a parliamentary committee in March of 2022. And we were asked by Superintendent McDonnell to comment on certain elements. And I personally believe that this document to a reader might seem unusual because the last component in relation to sexual assault seems to be out of context. That was a specific request due to a specific incident.
And I wasn't going to go to that part.
Okay.
But just, so I take it, given the fact that you reviewed and approved it, that the information in this document you consider to be accurate.
Yes.
So just before the title, towards the bottom of page 3, that says with respect to intelligence failure, you're discussing in the paragraph above that the freedom movement, or this document is discussing the freedom movement and the freedom convoy. And that paragraph concludes saying these potentially unintended consequences that stretched into national security realm could not be left unaddressed, and the political climate, along with the growing civil unrest of the movement as a whole, where threats of violence were omnipresent, and particular to the Ottawa occupation, appeared to necessitate enhanced policing powers to resolve the conflict. So the reference to the threats of violence were omnipresent. Is that in particular to relation to the Ottawa occupation, or was that the movement as a whole?
That was the movement as a whole, and they were threats of violence. The threats were omnipresent, and we tried to address them as we went along. In terms of producing intelligence, we found no credible intelligence of threats.
When you say you found no credible intelligence of threats, were you involved in the investigations into particular threats that were made to various politicians and other public figures in Ottawa, or is that something that the OPS dealt with?
Primarily, that would be activity that the OPS engaged in.
Okay.
And also, I'm talking about, threats generally that would be premised in intelligence. Like, I'll give you an example. On February 2nd at 1830 hours, we're going to breach security to the West Wing of Parliament, et cetera. And I have been engaged in protests before where things like that have happened, and we could find no credible intelligence
Of
Of threats.
those kinds of threats. So you're not talking about a threat that may be made against a particular individual, for example?
But we never, that's true, but we never had intelligence of that, threats of those. And I mean, I've reviewed the arrests and the charges and stuff to try and ascertain how accurate we were. And there was, I would say, the lack of violent crime was shocking. The lack, I mean, even in the arrests and charges, considering the whole thing in totality, I think there were 10 charges for violent crime, 6 of which were against police officers.
But where threats were made against individuals, precautions were taken to protect those individuals.
Right.
So
And- yeah,
those
yeah.
threats didn't actually materialize, but that doesn't
That's-
mean that the threats weren't originally credible.
Yeah, and I can't speak to whether those threats were, I mean, if they were, I guess charges would have been laid for uttering threats, death threats.
Potentially. But you
Well, if
weren't
there was an
involved, you
actual-
weren't involved in any of those.
No, but if there was an actual threat, then there would have been an investigation. And if there was an actual threat, I assume the Ottawa Police Service would have laid a charge for uttering threats.
If the person who uttered the threat could be identified.
Right, right.
Hard to lay a charge
Yeah,
if you can't
yeah.
identify an anonymous threat.
Or even to ascertain if it's an actual threat, if you can't identify the individual.
No,
Yeah.
but when security is provided,
Right.
then presumably the threat is credible.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, next is the Democracy Fund.
Good evening, everyone. I just have I'm getting a message here that I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it. Mr. Commissioner, if it's fine by you, I will ask my questions without any video.
I think that's probably the best way to proceed if we can't get video. If you're prepared to do that, otherwise we can find another option, but are you prepared to proceed on that basis?
I am prepared to proceed on that basis. Good evening, sir. My name is Alan Honor, and I am a lawyer from the Democracy Fund. I only have 5 minutes, but most of my questions have been answered. Can somebody please pull up OPP 50789? Sir, do you recall this email dated February 22nd, 2022? It is an email from you to Deputy Cox.
I do?
Sir, is it fair to say that in your view, policing should be apolitical, it should be objective, and it should view events in their context?
Yes.
In this letter, you say that law enforcement is at a critical stage in terms of its ethics, its operational independence, and its decision-making. Right at the top, sir, you agree with me?
Oh, yes, I agree.
Thank you very much.
That was an easy one.
And if we can scroll down to the second last paragraph of the second page, I'm going to read something to you. But before I do that, can you just confirm for me that it's fair to say that one of your concerns here is that the public discourse has become sensationalized and it's become inaccurate?
Yeah, so this is a large conversation. I mean, I think it's evident that I was concerned by a politicization, and I was concerned by hyperbole, and I was concerned by the affixing of labels without evidence to individuals, movements, et cetera. And if I can, I don't want to waste your time, but this doesn't just speak to this movement. I can give you a very specific example. Many people, law enforcement included, have an insatiable appetite. I can give you an example of person of interest profiles, et cetera. I've always been very hard and fast, no matter what the event is. I can use protests against Coastal GasLink, et cetera, that we don't do POI, person of interest profiles, unless we have reasonable grounds to suspect or reasonable grounds to believe that those individuals will be engaged in criminal activity or illegal activity that will present a public safety risk. And I believe that the public expects people like me in my position to consider those things in the course of my duties.
Your concerns aren't limited to this protest, but they do apply to this protest. Is that fair?
That's correct. Yep.
And I'm just going to read you one paragraph here, and then I'm going to ask you the question, which I really want to, which is what I really want to explore. And I'm almost finished here. But second last paragraph of the second page. But now the public discourse is dominated by political figures and the media. And the commentary is providing a very different picture from what law enforcement collectively gathered. It is painting a different picture. It speaks to extremism. It offers parallels to terrorism. It speaks of sedition. This is a reference to what is going on in Ottawa. Is that right?
It's a reference to what's going on in relation to the protest writ large, not just Ottawa, but Ottawa is certainly the largest component of it.
Thank you, sir. And here's my question to you. In your view, were politicians and the media responsible for a certain amount of disinformation and misinformation with respect to these protests?
I'm just trying to articulate this properly. I was concerned by comments made publicly by public figures and in the media that I believed were not premised in fact. I would be just another person with a subjective perspective in this case, except for the fact that from my perspective, I was leading the criminal intelligence collection of information and the production of criminal intelligence in relation to these events. So I believed I was in a unique situation to understand what was transpiring. So when I read accounts that the state of Russia had something to do with it, or that this was a result of American influence, either financially or ideologically, or that Donald Trump was behind it, or that it was un-Canadian, or that the people participating were un-Canadian, and that they were not Canadian views and they were extremists, I found it to be problematic because what I ascertained from my role, which is not all-knowing, and certainly there may be information that is presented to this committee that illustrates the error of my ways, but I did not see validation for those assertions.
You found it to be problematic, and the media was part of the problem. Is that right?
I hesitate to, I don't want to say that necessarily because the media has an important role, and I'm not trying to skirt the question. The media can provide editorials, and editorial boards can have stances. I believe that a lot of people were making assertions that weren't accurate, and if they were based in investigation and in fact, then there was information that I was not privy to, and I wondered why. And I accept that I might not be privy to it. If the Communications Security Establishment of Canada or the Canadian Security Intelligence Service or the Integrated National Security Enforcement Team has received information at a classification above my level, I accept that, and that's fine. I'm just saying that from my perspective as operational command of Hendon and that joint force operation, I did not see information that substantiated what was being said publicly and via the media. And I found that the subjective assertions sensationalized, yes, and exacerbated conflict.
Thank you. And just one last question for you when you speak of the media there. And when I read to you from your letter, you said the public discourse is dominated by the media. You're speaking about the mainstream media. Is that right?
Again, that's highly subjective. I mean, in my line of work,
so you can tell me what you meant.
Well, a lot of media that I read, I can't say that they were slanted, and I mean on both sides. I can't say that because I'd have to know subjectively what they were hoping to achieve. The person who was writing it could have objectively believed that they were speaking the truth, and I'm not in a position to know that. But I do know that there are multiple media outlets, and even the definition of media has altered substantially, and there are multiple perspectives, and some of those perspectives seem to be based in confirming a worldview as opposed to, and I'm not talking about editorials because that's different. I'm talking about news reporting. That's what's important to me because people, including law enforcement officers, are informed by that information. And I saw that information, those assertions, foreign influenced, monies, et cetera, being played out by any number of people and talked about. And I would challenge that. And my point in this email was to make this point, which I believe is an ethical and moral point, and a point premised in law. Things like mens rea and actus reus are incredibly important in this, in determining what we see and what we base it on. So the labeling was problematic to me.
Thank you, sir. I believe I'm out of time. So thank you for your answers to my questions.
Okay, thank you. Next is the CCLA.
Good evening, Superintendent Morris. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Good evening.
My name is Kara Zwiebel. I am a lawyer for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. I have also just 5 minutes with you, and I know I'm the only person now keeping everyone from their dinner, so I will try to be as brief as possible. If I could get the document actually that we just had up on the screen, OPP 40789, please.
Sorry,
And I just want to.
What was that number again? Sorry.
Sorry, it's OPP 40789.
Sorry, go ahead.
I don't think that was it. It was the email we were just looking at.
5 zeros.
Oh, 5 zeros. I'm sorry. Thank you. So I just want to take you to, if you can just scroll. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And here you're sort of explaining why you're writing this email, that you have a somewhat unique view into the intelligence that was gathered leading up to these events. And in the middle of the paragraph that begins further, you say, by way of example, I see a marked increase in the conversation of extremists participating in these events and Canadians with extreme ideologies leading the charge. Although there are exceptions, I have not seen evidence of this. In fact, Hendon received and reported very little of this activity. It was not in evidence at the Ambassador Bridge, nor events related to the Blue Water Bridge. Further, the events in Toronto did not illustrate this. By way of example, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service had very little to report on and noted that their targets were not engaged. INSET, and sorry, can you just tell us what INSET is?
Yeah, INSET is a federal joint force operation led by the RCMP. It stands for Integrated National Security Enforcement Team, and they have the responsibility to engage in investigations that meet the threshold of Section 83 of the Criminal Code.
Okay, and so INSET reported that the activity did not meet their threshold in national security. So I do not know where the political figures are acquiring information or intelligence on the extent of extremist involvement. So here, you're expressing the concern that this narrative around extremism is not consistent with the intelligence that you gathered, collected, reviewed over the course of the weeks leading up to these events.
That's correct.
Okay. And is it fair to say, I think Commission Counsel took you to, I think it was the February 7th, one of the February 7th documents, where you had a discussion about sort of the use of the term a threat to national security and why you were careful about that term and how you explained that to some of your colleagues within the OPP. Is it fair to say that at no point during the convoy protest did you receive reliable intelligence that would lead you to conclude that there was a risk to national security that would rise above the potential threat to national security that you identified in that report?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Can I get document OPP 40850? I think it's 4 zeros, maybe it's 5. This is going to be an email that you sent to, is it Deputy Commissioner Cox?
That's correct.
Okay, Deputy Commissioner Cox. And you're expressing here, this is dated February 2nd, so we're in the midst of these events. And you're saying that your POIB is increasingly receiving requests for information, intelligence, open source scrapes, background checks, etc., on a wide array of societal actors. Many of these entities are social movements that have perspectives that diverge from the mainstream. They may not be engaged in criminal activity, nor do we have grounds to believe or suspect that they are. These requests are emanating from many clients, internal and external to the OPP, at an escalating rate and with great urgency. And you're expressing some concerns here, and maybe we can scroll down. Can you explain the nature of your concerns about these requests for intelligence about various entities? I think this gets a little bit to the point that you were making in the questions you were just being posed a moment ago.
Yeah, there seems to be a causal linkage in some people's minds between certain things that are not illegal or criminal, they just may not be in line with, and a nexus to somehow an intelligence threat. I can give you an example. I have had instances where people have approached me professionally because there were bumper stickers that had to do with entities that they disagreed with. So therefore, those people shouldn't be police officers, or they shouldn't be parked in parking lots. And I heard terminology, that person is right wing, so, and then therefore an assumption. I used to hear all that all the time about left wing, and I was very concerned about it because I worked in anti-terrorism at the time of the 9/11 attacks, and I saw what these knee-jerk reactions do, where we get information from the public on any number of issues related to what they perceive to be threats from Wahhabism or Salafism or Sunni extremism. And there always seems to be an overreach that comes with this politicization. And I've had many instances where I've been asked to go through these intelligence checks without the reasonable grounds to suspect or believe that there is a threat posed. There is merely the presence of something or someone that someone doesn't like.
Okay, thank you. And on the ethical front, you noted you were concerned that the targets of these requests were not engaged in criminal activity, or there was no reasonable and probable grounds to believe that they were. Is that right?
Yeah. Can I give you an example, just to make an example of this?
Sure.
If somebody engages in criminal activity, violent activity, et cetera, that impacts people, such as has occurred in London, Ontario, such as occurred in Nova Scotia, these terrible things, or people who are engaged in weapons stockpiling, et cetera, or illegal activity, or we even have grounds to suspect that, then certainly ideological affiliations, religious motivation, political motivations, mental health issues, all become issues to assess and look at. But because somebody has, I'm just going to use an example, a Trump sticker on their bumper does not a requirement to put the powers of the state against that individual. It illustrates to me that somebody who owned that car previously or currently supported or wanted to be seen as supporting a former president or candidate Trump. And it's as simple as that.
Okay,
so it's indicative of politicization.
Thank you. That was my timer. I'm just, if I can get the Commission's indulgence for just one more question. You distinguished earlier between unlawful activity, civil disobedience, or civil disobedience and criminal activity. And am I right in saying that the you don't view all acts of civil disobedience as rising to the level of threats to national security or rising to the level of threats of acts of violence or even criminal activity.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I entirely got that, but you're asking me, you're saying, asking me to agree with that I don't agree that all acts of civil disobedience rise to the level of criminal activity? Is that the question?
No, that this was in relation to a question you were posed by Commission Counsel. I think in one of your reports, you noted that there was a serious risk of sort of a mass amount of civil disobedience.
Oh, okay.
And you distinguished between those acts and acts that might amount to serious criminal activity or that could pose threats to national security. There's a distinction between those things. Is that right?
Yes, there is a distinction. Yes, I agree with that. There's a distinction between, and I also premise that within where we, as an intelligence entity, focus. We don't focus on smaller acts of civil disobedience, i.e., a small business owner opening their business in contravention to the Reopening Ontario Act. That's a matter for education from a detachment or a police service and a possible laying of a provincial offense notice, et cetera, et cetera. But more broad issues and more significant issues of civil disobedience that present as public safety issues require our assessment and collection to determine the nature of the threat and the gravity of the threat. Does that answer your question?
Right. Yes, it does. There's a proportionality to these things.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Okay, next, the Ontario Provincial Police. Any
Indeed, Ms. B will need not worry about keeping everyone from your dinner. Now I'm not going to do that. But I promise to be very quick. Superintendent, my name is Christopher Diana, as you know. I'm counsel to the OPP. Just a couple of questions. You'll recall my friends from the commission brought you to a document that showed the various Hendon reports and their distribution. Do you remember seeing that document?
Yes.
And there were quite a large number of recipients, correct?
Yes, correct.
You mentioned some names of people you know within the Ottawa Police Service that received those reports, and you named them. I'm not going to, but you remember naming those individuals?
Yes, I do.
If a recipient organization or person wants to ask questions about a Hendon report, how do they go about doing that?
Well, one, we're open anytime to any questions. I myself am. Secondly, we had teleconferences regularly in relation to these events daily, and there was a lot of give and take, questions back and forth. And three, I communicated directly, I did so today, to the entire intelligence distribution list and actually created a different distribution list of intelligence managers to articulate goals, intentions, et cetera, and soliciting any feedback.
So before the arrival of the convoy in Ottawa, did you receive any requests directly from Ottawa Police Service for more information about intelligence or to clarify any of the information that had been provided?
We received no requests for extra activity. That we received a great deal of gratitude for the activity that was ongoing.
Do you recall whether you received gratitude from Ottawa Police Service?
Yes, we did from the people involved in intelligence, et cetera.
And do you recall any of the specific individuals that gave you that gratitude?
Yeah, I remember Superintendent Mark Patterson saying thank you, for the collection efforts in the intelligence products. I believe Inspector Bryden as well. And I remember Interim Chief Bell saying, thank you in terms of the Big 12 meetings, et cetera, for the information.
Before the arrival of the convoy, did anyone from any of your recipient organizations express any concerns about the quality of your intelligence product?
No, absolutely not.
Thank you, Superintendent. Those are my questions.
Okay, any re-examination?
None, Commissioner.
Okay, I just have maybe a general question. You talked about, and we heard a lot about, Project Hendon. Is there a federal equivalent to that type of updated information circular almost, like you provide?
Sorry, sir. I'm not aware of any federal project that is equivalent to Hendon. I can say that my RCMP colleagues are very engaged in Hendon, and this can't be comprehensive, but the divisional intelligence officers are engaged, INSET is engaged, federal policing, national security is engaged, protective security is engaged. There's an entity, and it's an acronym, in relation to ideologically motivated extremists that are engaged, and at various times, other divisions such as Alberta and British Columbia, et cetera, participated.
Do you know of any reason why it's Ontario that's, and the Ontario Provincial Police that's quarterbacking this rather than a federal agency?
That's a good question. I do know the reason. I know the reason is because we started it. That is the reason, and that question has been asked to me several times. Yeah, we started the Project Hendon, so that's the reason why we are.
And then just another thing, and I'm not sure, my note is not clear, but I thought you distinguished between a potential national security threat or a risk of national security, to national security. Is there a difference between the two? And could you explain that for me?
I think it's lexicon or semantics. The highest level we got to was a potential for the national security threats. I would like to place that in context, just to be fair to all parties. So Ottawa is transpiring, Coots is transpiring, the events in the Ambassador Bridge occur, and then there was posturing on the 402, not at the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, Port Huron, but close. And we had other information in relation to the Nipigon Bridge, not a border, but an incredibly important logistical link in northwestern Ontario, and Pigeon River between Minnesota and Ontario. So when we talk about potential national security, that's what we were concerned with. If those events transpire, and if they're successful, then that's very problematic in terms of our national borders.
Now, you didn't mention the Manitoba border crossing or the Surrey border crossing. Is there a reason for that?
No, I didn't mention them. You know, I heard about them at the time. I honestly, sir, I haven't been. Were others. The Peace Bridge, Fort Erie and Buffalo was a significant one. The bridge at Cornwall was very short-lived, a threat. It was going to be, and it ended very quickly. The Lansdowne crossing east of Gananoque, Watertown, was also the organic mobilization. Once the example was set, these were all possibilities, and so we tried to posture to try to prevent.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your testimony, and it was very interesting and forthright. We thank you very much. You're free to go.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
So we're now going to break until tomorrow morning, 9:30, and tomorrow should be a little bit shorter day, but don't count on it. We have always some uncertainties, which makes it always a challenge, but also interesting.
The commission is adjourned. La commission est adjournée.